On a bright Wednesday morning in September 1980, inside a quiet villa in Asunción, Paraguay, a 54-year-old man named Anastasio Somoza finished his breakfast of tropical fruit and coffee. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the faint hum of a ceiling fan overhead. He looked at his beautiful companion and shared a laugh about their dinner plans for that evening. Everything was perfect, but the moment his driver turned the key in the ignition, a shadow moved in a window across the street. The man who had spent his life crushing rebellions was about to become the victim of one. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today we are diving into a series of 13 stories that span the globe, uncovering the dark corners of history where power meets a violent end. We will be traveling from the sun-drenched streets of South America to the secretive halls of the Kremlin. It is a long journey through the strange, dark, and mysterious, so I am glad you are here to walk this path with me as we peel back the layers of these forgotten crimes. Before we begin, I want you to listen to the rain hitting the window pane and just settle into your favorite chair. If you enjoy these deep dives into the shadows, please consider leaving a tip or hitting that subscribe button and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your support is the only thing that keeps these stories alive in the digital void. We are a small community of mystery seekers, and I truly value every single one of you who decides to join our inner circle. But before we get to the first story, I have a small favor to ask involving the like button. I want you to invite the like button over for a very expensive and scenic drive in a vintage white Mercedes-Benz. While you are cruising down a beautiful boulevard, tell the like button you have a special surprise in the trunk. When it leans over to look, I want you to drop a heavy steel rocket launcher tube directly onto its head. Do not explain why you did it, just drive away and never look back. Now, I need you to do me a favor. Take a second to make sure your front door is locked and the deadbolt is turned. Check the feed on your security cameras and make sure no one is standing just outside the reach of the porch light. The world can be a very dangerous place for those who do not pay attention to the small details. Once you are sure that you are safe and sound, take a deep breath and let yourself slide into the first story of the night. It starts on a very normal morning. On the morning of Wednesday, September 17th, 1980, a 54-year-old man named Anastasio Somoza de Bale was reclining in the leather back seat of his white Mercedes-Benz sedan in Asunción, Paraguay. He was dressed in a light suit suited for the humid weather of the region. Beside him sat his trusted business advisor, a man who had helped him manage his vast fortune even in exile. They were moving through the city with a sense of routine that felt unbreakable. The car was cruising at a leisurely pace down the sun-drenched stretch of Avenida España, a beautiful boulevard lined with trees and affluent homes. To any passerby, it was just another luxury vehicle carrying an important man to an important meeting. There were no sirens and no flashing lights to draw attention to the former dictator. He was a man who had once ruled a nation with an iron fist, but here, in this quiet foreign capital, he felt like a simple citizen enjoying the morning. For the last year, Anastasio had been living a life of quiet luxury in Paraguay after being forced out of his home country of Nicaragua. He was the last of a long line of rulers who had controlled that nation for decades, and he had brought a significant portion of his wealth with him. He spent his days managing his investments and his nights dining at the finest restaurants in Asunción. He was a man who believed that his past could not reach him across the borders of South America. He had developed a very close relationship with the ruler of Paraguay, a man named Alfredo Stroessner. Both men understood the weight of power and the necessity of maintaining order through any means possible. Stroessner had given Anastasio a personal guarantee of safety, ensuring that the secret police were always watching over his villa. Because of this, Anastasio often traveled with only a small security detail, feeling that the iron grip of his host was enough to keep him safe. The former leader was a man of grand plans and even grander dreams for the future. He did not see himself as a man in hiding, but rather as a leader in temporary transition. He spent hours on the phone with his contacts back home, convinced that the political tides would eventually turn in his favor. He was already drafting the blueprints for his eventual return to the presidential palace. He believed that the people who had ousted him would soon realize they could not survive without him. His personal life was equally full of light and warmth during this period of exile. He was deeply involved with a beautiful woman, and they spent their weekends at a private estate outside the city. They talked about buying a yacht and sailing around the world once the political dust had settled. To him, the world was a playground that he still owned, and his current situation was merely a brief intermission in a very long and successful play. He felt completely and utterly invincible. On this specific morning, the air inside the Mercedes was cool and smelled of expensive cologne and tobacco. Anastasio was leaning forward to show his advisor a map of a new real estate project he was considering in the northern suburbs. He was pointing at a specific plot of land, his finger tracing the boundary lines with precision. He was smiling because he knew he was about to make another several $1,000,000. The sun was reflecting off his gold watch as he gestured wildly. The white Mercedes slowed down as it approached a red light near a modest two-story house on the corner. Anastasio did not even look out the window at the building, as it was a structure he had passed hundreds of times before. It was just a part of the background of his new life. He was tracing a map of a new empire, unaware that his own path was about to reach its final, fiery dead end on that very street. Inside that ordinary house, 7 people had been living in total silence for weeks, watching his every move through a small hole. They had memorized the exact second his car left the villa every morning. They knew which side of the car he sat on, and they knew the caliber of the glass in his windows. These were not local criminals, but a highly trained commando unit from Argentina who had traveled across the continent for one purpose. They had rented the house under false names and spent their nights cleaning their weapons in the dark. To them, the man in the white Mercedes was a monster that needed to be erased. The leader of the group was a man who had lost his entire family to political violence years before. He stood by the window with a heavy rocket launcher resting on his shoulder, his eye pressed against the sight. He could see the reflection of the trees on the polished roof of the car. He could see the driver checking the rearview mirror. He took a slow breath and felt the cold metal of the trigger against his skin. He did not feel hatred in that moment, only a deep sense of duty. The car came to a complete stop as a blue pickup truck pulled out in front of it, blocking the lane. The driver of the Mercedes honked his horn, thinking it was just a frustrated local driver making a mistake. Anastasio looked up from his map, a slight scowl forming on his face at the delay. He was an impatient man who was not used to being held up by the common public. He began to say something to his advisor about the declining quality of the local traffic enforcement. Suddenly, the front door of the modest house across the street burst open. 2 men stepped out onto the sidewalk, carrying automatic rifles. The sound of the first burst of gunfire was not loud like in the movies. It was a sharp, rhythmic tapping that sounded like a heavy typewriter. The bullet struck the engine block of the Mercedes, causing white smoke to billow out from under the hood. The smell of gasoline and hot metal instantly filled the air, cutting through the scent of cologne. Inside the car, time seemed to stretch into an infinite loop of confusion. Anastasio watched as a row of small holes appeared in the dashboard in front of him. He felt a spray of cold glass hit his cheek, but he did not feel any pain yet. His first thought was that this must be a mistake, perhaps a training exercise gone wrong or a local gang war he had accidentally driven into. He shouted at his driver to move the car, but the driver was already slumped over the steering wheel. The heavy thud of a rocket launcher firing is a sound that vibrates in the marrow of your bones. It is a low, hollow boom that is followed by a terrifying whistle as the projectile cuts through the air. The commandos had practiced this shot for months on dummy targets in the jungle. The rocket hit the center of the Mercedes just as the advisor was trying to open the back door to escape. There was a fraction of a second where the car seemed to glow from the inside out. Then, the world turned into a roar of orange flame and black smoke. The force of the explosion was so great that it lifted the 2-ton vehicle 3 feet off the ground before slamming it back down. The shockwave shattered every window within a 2-block radius and knocked pedestrians off their feet. The white paint of the Mercedes was vaporized instantly, leaving behind a blackened skeleton of twisted steel that looked like it had been pulled from the bottom of a furnace. If you were standing on that sidewalk, the heat would have felt like a physical wall pushing against your chest. The sound was so absolute that it silenced the rest of the city for a long minute. The commandos did not wait to see the results of their work. They dropped their heavy weapons on the pavement and ran toward a getaway car parked in the alleyway. They moved with a clinical efficiency, their faces hidden behind masks, leaving behind a scene of absolute devastation. The secret police arrived within minutes, their boots crunching on the thousands of shards of glass that covered the street. They found the blue pickup truck abandoned and the house across the street empty. When they approached the remains of the white Mercedes, the metal was still ticking as it cooled. One officer tried to reach for the door handle, but the metal was so hot it melted the skin on his fingertips. There was no sound coming from inside the car, only the crackle of flames. The investigation was a frantic and violent affair led by a furious Alfredo Stroessner. He ordered the borders closed and had his men raid every hotel and boarding house in the country. He could not believe that an elite team of assassins had lived under his nose for so long without being detected. The local police found evidence in the house that showed the commandos had been eating nothing but canned food and water to avoid going to the market where they might be recognized. The forensic team had to wait hours for the wreckage to cool down enough to recover the remains. What they found inside was a testament to the power of modern explosives. The interior of the car had been stripped of all leather and plastic, leaving only the bare metal frame. The bodies of the driver and the advisor were found in pieces, but the seat where Anastasio had been sitting was almost entirely empty. The blast had been focused directly on his position in the rear right. In the days that followed, the government of Nicaragua, now led by the rebels who had ousted him, celebrated the news in the streets. They saw it as the final closing of a dark chapter in their history. Meanwhile, in Paraguay, the atmosphere was one of intense paranoia. The myth of the untouchable dictator had been shattered by a single rocket in broad daylight. People began to realize that no matter how much money or power you had, you were always just one window away from the end. The commandos were eventually identified as members of the Revolutionary People's Army, a radical group from Argentina. They had spent over $1 million of their own funds to organize the hit, viewing it as a symbolic strike against all dictators in the region. Most of the team managed to escape into the dense jungles of the border regions, disappearing into the shadows of history. They had achieved what an entire army could not do during the Civil War back in Nicaragua. If you were to stand at that busy urban intersection in Asunción today, in 2026, the site on Avenida España is a busy urban intersection with no plaque or marker to indicate what happened there. The house where the assassins stayed was torn down years ago to make room for a modern office building. The legacy of Anastasio Somoza is now confined to history books and the memories of those who lived through his reign. His vast fortune was tied up in legal battles for decades, slowly being bled dry by lawyers and government seizures. The most haunting detail of the entire scene was not the fire or the smoke, but what the recovery team found on the floorboards of the back seat. Amidst the ash and the melted glass, there were two pristine leather shoes sitting side by side, as if they had been placed there by a valet. They were the only things in the car that had not been blackened by the soot. They did not find his body among the twisted metal, they only found his shoes with his feet still inside them. The transition from a position of absolute power to a pile of ash happens in the blink of an eye, and it often leaves behind a vacuum that is filled by even greater darkness. While Somoza met his end on a sunny street in Paraguay, another man was preparing to turn an entire government hall into a theater of death. Geography is the only thing that separates a street-side explosion from a systematic execution, but the hunger for total control remains exactly the same. On the afternoon of Tuesday, July 22, 1980, a 42-year-old leader named Saddam Hussein was calmly lighting a cigar on the high stage of the Cold Hall in the city of Baghdad, Iraq. He wore a sharp olive-green military uniform that was pressed perfectly, and his eyes scanned the audience of hundreds with a chilling stillness. The hall was a grand space, built to showcase the power and the modern future of a nation that was rising fast on a tide of oil. The hundreds of men sitting in the plush velvet seats were not his enemies, but his closest allies and the high-ranking members of the Ba'ath Party. They had worked together for years to seize control of the country and build a vision of a unified Arab empire. To them, Saddam was a brother and a hero who had led them to the pinnacle of political influence. They believed that they were the chosen few who would guide Iraq into a golden age of wealth and international respect. The air inside the hall was chilled to perfection by powerful industrial air conditioning units, making the desert heat outside seem like a distant memory. There was a sense of camaraderie and triumph in the air as the men chatted quietly among themselves before the session began. They were the elite, the architects of a new world, and they felt completely safe within the walls of their own headquarters. They were surrounded by friends and colleagues they had known for decades. Iraq was at a turning point in 1980, with its oil revenues reaching record highs and its social programs being the envy of the Middle East. These men in the audience felt like they were the masters of the universe, and their loyalty to the party was their greatest badge of honor. They believed that their collective efforts had finally paid off and that they were now untouchable. They looked up at Saddam on the stage with a deep sense of pride and shared accomplishment. What most people do not realize is that many of these men had been with Saddam since his days as an underground revolutionary. They had shared meals in hiding and survived numerous assassination attempts together. They considered themselves a brotherhood bound by blood and a shared ideology. Their plans for the future were grand, involving the modernization of the military and the expansion of the educational system. They saw a bright and prosperous future ahead for their children. The atmosphere was almost like a family reunion where everyone was celebrating a great success. There was no indication of tension or fear as the session was called to order. Saddam took a long pull from his expensive Cuban cigar and let the smoke drift slowly toward the high ceiling. He looked like a man who was deeply satisfied with his position and his people. He gestured for a camera crew to begin filming the proceedings, saying it was for the benefit of history. While the men in the hall cheered for their leader, the list of names in Saddam's pocket had already turned their seats into a waiting room for the dead. Behind the heavy curtains of the stage, a team of armed guards was already standing by with a list of names. The cameras were not there to record a speech of celebration, but to capture a masterclass in psychological warfare. The men in the seats were about to be forced into a nightmare that would destroy their souls before it ended their lives. They believed they were the audience. If you were sitting in one of those seats, you would feel the vibrations of the cooling system and the faint scent of tobacco in the air. You would be leaning back, perhaps thinking about the dinner you had planned with your wife and children after the meeting. You might have even been planning a vacation to Europe with the bonus you expected to receive for your loyalty. The world felt stable and the future felt certain, right up until the moment Saddam leaned into the microphone. The room fell into a total and heavy silence as Saddam began to speak about a secret conspiracy within the party. He spoke softly at first, his voice carrying a tone of deep disappointment rather than anger. You would have felt a small chill run down your spine, but you would have told yourself it was just the air conditioning. You would have looked at the man next to you and assumed that if there was a traitor, it certainly could not be someone sitting in this room. The only sound in the hall was the slow, rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall and the occasional rustle of paper from the stage. Saddam reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stack of white cards, each one containing a name. The sweat began to bead on the foreheads of the men in the front rows, even though the temperature remained cool. They were still telling themselves that this was just a routine security check, or perhaps a test of their internal loyalty. Nobody in that room was prepared for what came next. Saddam began to read the first name in a clear and steady voice that echoed through the sound system. A man near the middle of the hall stood up, his face as white as a ghost, as guards appeared from the shadows to escort him out. As each name was read, a new sense of terror began to fill the space. The men who remained in their seats began to realize that the person sitting right next to them might be the next to vanish. What happened next defies logic and humanity in its cold calculation. Saddam began to weep on the stage, wiping away tears as he claimed to be heartbroken by the betrayal of his closest friends. It was a terrifying piece of theater that left the audience paralyzed with fear and confusion. They watched as 68 of their colleagues were led away, one by one, into the bright sunlight of the courtyard outside. The remaining men began to shout their loyalty to Saddam in a panic. The screaming in the hall grew louder as the men realized that their only hope of survival was to prove that they were more loyal than the ones who had been taken. They stood on their chairs and chanted slogans of support for the leader, their voices cracking with desperation. They were trying to drown out the sound of their own fear, but the guards were already moving toward the doors. The realization was sinking in that they were not just witnesses to this purge, but participants. The true horror of the day reached its climax when Saddam ordered the remaining party members to follow the guards outside. They were led to a long trench that had been dug behind the building, where their 68 friends were standing with their hands tied behind their backs. The survivors were handed assault rifles and told that they would be the ones to carry out the executions. This was the shared guilt that would bind the survivors to Saddam forever in a web of blood. If you were holding one of those rifles, your hands would have been shaking so hard that the metal would have rattled against your rings. You would be looking into the eyes of a man you had known for 20 years, a man who had been at your wedding and helped you raise your children. But you also knew that if you did not pull that trigger, you would be the next one pushed into the trench. The silence in the courtyard was broken only by the sound of heavy breathing. The first volley of shots was ragged and disorganized as the men struggled to aim through their tears and their trembling. Saddam stood on a nearby balcony, watching the scene with the same calm expression he had held in the hall. He wanted to make sure that every single survivor had blood on their hands. He wanted to ensure that no one could ever claim innocence or distance themselves from the violence. It was a ritual of absolute and irreversible complicity. The smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood filled the hot afternoon air as the task was completed. The survivors were forced to walk past the bodies in the trench and look at what they had done. They were then marched back into the cold hall, where the air was still cool and the smell of cigar smoke still lingered. They were told to sit back down in their velvet seats and continue the session as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened in the last hour. I have covered a lot of dark stories, but the level of psychological manipulation in this event is truly haunting. Saddam did not just kill his enemies, he forced his friends to do it for him, effectively murdering their humanity before he ever had to worry about their loyalty. This single afternoon transformed the Iraqi government into a closed criminal enterprise where the only rule was survival. The survivors left that hall as different people than they had been that morning. The aftermath of the purge was a nation gripped by a level of fear that is hard for most people to comprehend. Hundreds of more arrests followed in the coming days as the secret police moved through the city. The families of the executed men were often forced to pay for the bullets that had been used to kill their loved ones. The Ba'ath Party was no longer a political organization. It was a cult of personality where everyone was a potential victim and a potential executioner. Looking back from the perspective of a very different Iraq in 2026, the Cold Hall still stands in Baghdad, though it has been repurposed many times since the fall of the regime. The footage of that afternoon has been digitized and is studied by psychologists and historians around the world as the ultimate example of how to seize total control through terror. Most of the men who pulled the triggers that day are now dead, either through subsequent purges or the various wars that plagued the country for decades. The legacy of the 1980 purge is a shadow that still hangs over the political culture of the region. It proved that in the quest for absolute power, there is no such thing as a safe relationship or a guaranteed alliance. The men who walked out of that hall were survivors, but they were also ghosts who would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. They had learned the hardest way possible that the man sitting at the head of the table was the only one who mattered. The feeling of cold metal and heavy guilt is a weight that never leaves a man, and it is a weight that can sometimes be found in the most unexpected places. While Saddam used theater and violence to secure his grip on Iraq, other men were using the law and the financial systems of their nations to achieve the same dark ends. Treachery does not always require a trench and a firing squad. Sometimes it only requires a signature on a piece of paper in a quiet office. On a quiet Friday evening, the 16th of October, 1980, a 41-year-old high-profile lawyer named Edward Shamwana was sitting in his plush office in the capital city of Lusaka, Zambia. The room was decorated with heavy mahogany furniture and leather-bound law books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The soft glow of a desk lamp illuminated the intricate legal documents spread out before him as he worked late into the night while the city hummed. The office was located in a prestigious district where the most powerful men in the country conducted their business. Through the window, the lights of the city twinkled like fallen stars against the dark African sky. Shamwana was a man of immense influence and respect, a pillar of the legal community who had spent decades mastering the nuances of the Zambian constitution. He felt a deep sense of pride in his accomplishments and the status he had earned through years of work. Edward Shamwana was not just a successful lawyer, he was an intellectual force who moved through the highest circles of society with an effortless grace. He was frequently invited to state dinners and private gatherings of the nation's elite, where his opinion was sought on matters of great importance. People saw him as a man of integrity, someone who believed in the rule of law and the progress of his young nation. He was a symbol of the professional class in Zambia. Behind this facade of professional excellence, however, a deep and bitter dissatisfaction had been festering for years. Shamwana looked at the presidency of Kenneth Kaunda and saw a nation that was struggling under the weight of a one-party system. He believed that the economy was stagnant and that the leadership had become disconnected from the needs of the people. To him, the current government was a barrier to the prosperous future that he believed Zambia truly deserved. He began to meet in secret with other members of the elite who shared his vision for a different kind of country. These were not radical revolutionaries or street fighters, but wealthy businessmen, high-ranking military officers, and other legal professionals. They gathered in the shadows of expensive homes and private clubs, speaking in hushed tones about the necessity of a change in leadership. They saw themselves as the true patriots, who were willing to take a great risk. Shamwana became the primary architect of a plan that was as sophisticated as any legal brief he had ever written. He used his vast knowledge of the government's structure to identify the exact points of failure that could be exploited to bring about a swift transition of power. He was convinced that if they could remove the president, the rest of the administration would collapse like a house of cards. He spent months drafting the documents for a new interim government. The plan involved more than just local support, as Shimwana and his associates began to funnel massive amounts of money into a secret fund. They used their connections in the financial world to move capital across borders without raising suspicion. Part of this wealth was used to hire a group of mercenaries from the neighboring country of Zaire. These men were experienced soldiers who were willing to do the dirty work of a coup for the right price in American dollars. Shimwana believed that he was creating a perfect operation that would result in a bloodless takeover of the state. He envisioned a scenario where the president's plane would be intercepted and Kaunda would be forced to sign a resignation letter at gunpoint. It was a cold and clinical approach to a revolution, designed by a man who preferred the precision of the courtroom to the chaos of the battlefield. He felt that his superior intellect would guarantee their success. In his mind, he was already the leader of a new and improved Zambia, a nation where the law would be applied fairly and the economy would flourish under his guidance. He spent his evenings imagining the speech he would give to the nation once the takeover was complete. He felt no guilt about the path he was taking, only a sense of historical destiny. He was a man who had convinced himself that his personal ambition was identical to the collective will of the people. He was signing a document he believed would bring freedom, oblivious to the fact that his own name was being typed into a high-security prison ledger at that exact moment. While he was carefully moving his pieces across the board, the Zambian intelligence services had already infiltrated his inner circle. They had planted a high-level mole within his financial network, who was documenting every single transaction and every secret meeting. The government was not caught off guard. They were simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every time Shimwana shook hands with a new conspirator or signed a secret agreement, a report was being filed in a folder on the president's desk. The state was allowing the plot to mature, so they could catch every single individual involved in one swift motion. The very systems of law and finance that Shimwana believed he was using to his advantage were being turned into a trap that was slowly closing around him. He was a master of the law who was being outmaneuvered. On that particular Friday, the air in Lusaka was heavy with the scent of approaching rain and the distant sound of traffic. Shimwana was reviewing a list of the military units that had supposedly pledged their support to the cause. He felt a surge of confidence as he saw the names of generals and colonels on the paper. He believed that the pieces were finally in place for the operation to begin in just a few days. He was at the absolute peak of his secret power. If you were standing in that hallway outside his office, you would have noticed a subtle change in the environment. The usual nighttime sounds of the building seemed to fade away, replaced by an unnatural and heavy silence. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to stutter for a brief moment, and the lights flickered just once before returning to their steady glow. It was the kind of shift that you only notice in your peripheral vision, but it carries a weight of dread. Shimwana paused his work for a moment and looked at the door. He felt a strange vibration in the floorboards, a rhythmic pulsing that did not match the sounds of the street below. He told himself that it was probably just the old plumbing in the building, or perhaps a heavy truck passing by on the road. He was a man of logic who did not believe in omens or instincts, so he dismissed the feeling and returned to his documents, convinced that everything was fine. The smell of ozone from the coming storm began to fill the room, and he reached over to close the window. As he did, he saw several dark figures moving quickly across the parking lot below. They were dressed in tactical gear and moved with a precision that was different from the regular police. He felt a momentary twinge of concern, but he quickly rationalized it as a routine security patrol for the nearby government buildings. He did not realize his time had run out. The silence of the office was shattered by the sound of the heavy mahogany door being kicked off its hinges. A team of armed officers from the paramilitary police flooded into the room, their weapons trained directly on the lawyer. Shimwana sat frozen in his chair, the legal documents still clutched in his hands. The transition from the quiet dignity of his office to the chaotic violence of an arrest happened in less time than it takes to draw a single breath of air. As the officers began to search the room, they moved with a clinical efficiency that showed they knew exactly what they were looking for. They bypassed the standard filing cabinets and went straight to a hidden compartment behind the bookshelf. Inside, they found the master blueprints for the coup and the signed agreements with the mercenaries from Zaire. The look on the officers' faces was not one of surprise, but of grim satisfaction. They had found the evidence. What followed was a series of simultaneous raids across the city as the rest of the conspirators were pulled from their beds and their offices. The sophisticated network that Shimwana had built over months was dismantled in a matter of hours. The high-profile lawyers and businessmen were led away in handcuffs, their faces hidden from the cameras that had suddenly appeared. The dream of a new Zambia had turned into a nightmare of treason charges and cold prison cells. The subsequent trial was a sensation that gripped the entire nation, as the details of the plot were laid bare in open court. The prosecution presented the financial records and the testimony of the undercover agents who had been watching Shimwana for months. The most damaging piece of evidence was a recording of a meeting where the lawyer discussed the plan to force the president's resignation at gunpoint. His own voice was the primary witness against his innocence. During the proceedings, Shimwana maintained a stoic and defiant expression, refusing to beg for mercy or show any sign of regret. He argued that his actions were motivated by a genuine love for his country and a desire to see it free from what he called a decaying dictatorship. But the law that he had spent his life studying was now the very thing that was being used to condemn him. The forensic precision of his own plan was now being used as a roadmap for his conviction. In 1983, Edward Shimwana was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death by hanging. The man who had once been a candidate for the highest offices in the land was now an inmate on death row. He spent years in a small cell, listening to the sounds of the prison and waiting for a knock on the door that would signify the end. The irony of his situation was not lost on him, as he spent his time reading the very law books that had failed to protect him. In the quiet legal archives of a modern and peaceful Zambia in 2026, the memory of the Shimwana coup plot remains a cautionary tale in Zambian history. Edward Shimwana was eventually granted a presidential pardon and released from prison, but his reputation and his influence were gone forever. He lived out his remaining years in relative obscurity, a ghost of the man who had once tried to seize the world. The nation he tried to change continued on its own path, leaving his blueprints to gather dust in the archives. The weight of a secret is often measured by the distance it travels before it is finally uncovered by the light of day. For Edward Shimwana, that distance was the length of a mahogany desk and the thickness of a leather-bound book. He believed that the law was a tool that he could manipulate to fit his own vision of the truth. But in the end, the truth proved to be a far more powerful force than any legal argument or any mercenary army could ever hope to overcome. The shift from the stability of a law office to the cold reality of a prison cell is a journey that many men of power have taken when they let their ambition outrun their ethics. But there are other journeys that are far more desperate, involving the thin air of the sky and the cold steel of a hijacked aircraft. When a person feels they have no other options left, they often turn to the most extreme measures to find their way to a freedom that they believe is waiting for them. The transition between the world of documents and the world of high-altitude terror is a bridge built of desperation and the hope for a better life. As we leave the quiet streets of Lusaka and the broken dreams of a lawyer, we look toward the frozen landscapes of the north. There, the struggle for freedom would not be fought in a courtroom, but in the cramped cabin of a passenger plane. The price of a mistake in that environment is often measured in blood and fire. He was the man who understood the law better than anyone else in the nation, until the day he decided that he was the only one allowed to rewrite it. On the morning of Wednesday, March 18, 1981, a 27-year-old named Wright Viagipu and his brother Eric were standing in line at the Tallinn airport in Estonia. They were preparing to board an Aeroflot flight destined for Murmansk, a city deep within the Soviet Arctic Circle. The air in the terminal was cold and smelled of floor wax and cheap tobacco. Wright adjusted the wool coat he wore despite the warmth of the crowded indoor terminal. The brothers were 27 and 23 years old, looking like any other young Soviet citizens traveling for work or family. They carried small bags and moved with a quiet efficiency that did not draw any unwanted attention from the armed guards patrolling the gates. To the outside world, this was a routine domestic trip, but hidden beneath their clothes were homemade weapons and a plan that would change the course of their lives forever in a single morning. Life in Estonia during the early 1980s felt like living inside a gray box that was slowly shrinking. Wright and Eric grew up in a world where every word was monitored, and every dream of the West was treated like a crime. They worked long hours in state factories, earning just enough to survive, but never enough to thrive. The brothers shared a small apartment and spent their evenings listening to forbidden radio stations from across the sea for any hope. They were incredibly close, bound together by a shared hatred for the system that dictated their every move. Rate was the planner, the one who looked at maps and studied the schedules of international flights. Eric was the dreamer, the one who talked about the bright lights of Helsinki and the taste of freedom that surely waited just across the water. They promised each other that they would either escape together or die trying to find a way out of the Soviet Union. Their plan was born from a deep sense of desperation that most people today would find hard to imagine. They didn't want money or fame, they just wanted to own their own lives. They spent months gathering materials for their weapons, secretly welding metal scraps in the back of the factory during their lunch breaks. They believed that if they could just get a pilot to turn the plane toward Finland, the authorities would have no choice but to let them go to the west. The brothers had a favorite spot on the coast where they would sit and watch the horizon on clear days. They could almost see the outline of the Finnish coast, a silhouette of a world that seemed like a paradise compared to their own. They talked about starting a small business together once they arrived, maybe a repair shop or a cafe where they could talk freely without looking over their shoulders. It was a beautiful dream that kept them going through the cold winter. Rate had a girlfriend named Elena who knew nothing of their plans. On their last night together, he took her to a small park and gave her a silver necklace he had saved for months to buy. He held her hand and told her that things would be better soon, though he couldn't explain how. The scent of her perfume and the warmth of her hand were the last things he wanted to remember if the plan went wrong. He felt a crushing guilt for leaving her behind in the gray city. The brothers spent their final evening at home eating a simple meal of bread and salted fish. They didn't say much, as the weight of what they were about to do pressed down on them. Eric kept checking the time on the wall clock, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the wooden table. They had checked their homemade devices a dozen times, ensuring everything was ready. The silence in the room felt heavy, like the air right before a massive storm hits the entire coast. They had chosen the flight to Murmansk specifically because it passed relatively close to the Finnish border during its ascent. It was a short window of opportunity, but they believed it was their best chance. They had studied the fuel capacity of the aircraft and the typical response times of the Soviet interceptor jets. To them, it was a mathematical equation where the result was either liberty or a cold cell in a labor camp located deep in the heart of the East. As they walked through the terminal toward the boarding gate, Rate felt the weight of the metal device against his ribs. It was cold and awkward, a constant reminder of the risk they were taking. He looked at his younger brother and saw the sweat beading on Eric's upper lip. He reached out and squeezed Eric's shoulder, a silent gesture of support that had passed between them 1,000 times since they were children. They were in this together until the very end. The boarding process was surprisingly smooth, with the gate agents barely looking up from their paperwork as the brothers handed over their tickets. They found their seats in the middle of the cabin, surrounded by other travelers who were mostly government workers or military personnel. The smell of jet fuel and old upholstery was overwhelming. Rate buckled his seatbelt and took a deep breath, trying to slow the frantic pounding of his heart inside his narrow chest. They watched the ground fall away as the plane lifted off from the runway, the gray buildings of Tallinn shrinking into toy houses. The clouds were thick and white, obscuring the view of the Baltic Sea below. Eric looked out the window and gripped the armrest until his knuckles turned white. He was thinking about the life they were leaving behind and the one they hoped to find. For a moment, it felt like they were already halfway to their new home in the distant north. The cabin was quiet, filled with the low hum of the engines and the soft rustle of newspapers. Most of the passengers were staring blankly ahead, caught in the boredom of a routine flight. Rate leaned over and whispered a final word of encouragement to his brother. He felt a sudden surge of adrenaline that made his vision sharpen. The time for planning was over, and the time for action had arrived. They were ready to make their move for a better life in the West. They were dreaming of the Finnish horizon, not knowing that their flight had been grounded by a secret KGB file before they even stepped onto the tarmac. One of the men they had trusted with their secret, a close friend they had known for years, had walked into a police station 3 days earlier. He had provided the KGB with the date, the flight number, and the descriptions of the weapons. The entire plan was a trap, and the authorities were simply waiting for the brothers to commit the act on the aircraft. As the plane reached its cruising altitude, the air inside the cabin seemed to thin out, becoming unnaturally cold. Rate noticed that the flight attendants were not moving down the aisle with the usual drink carts. Instead, they were huddled at the back of the plane, their faces pale and their eyes darting toward the passengers. The normal sounds of the aircraft felt muffled, as if the entire cabin had been wrapped in a thick layer of wet wool by some invisible force. He looked toward the front of the plane and saw a man in a dark suit standing near the cockpit door. The man was not a member of the crew, and he held himself with a rigid posture that suggested military training. Raitt felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. He tried to tell himself that it was just an air marshal, a common sight on Soviet flights. It was probably just a coincidence, he thought, trying to ignore the way his hands shook as he reached for his bag. Eric noticed the change too and turned to look at his brother with questioning eyes. Raitt gave him a small nod, signaling that they should proceed anyway. They believed that if they showed their weapons, the crew would have to obey them. It was a desperate form of self-deception, a refusal to see the signs of the trap that was already closing around them. They stood up from their seats at the same time, their hands reaching for the hidden metal devices under their coats. The moment the brothers stood up, the atmosphere in the cabin shattered. Raitt pulled the homemade device from his coat, shouting for the pilot to change course for Finland. His voice sounded thin and high in the pressurized air. He expected the other passengers to scream or dive for cover, but instead they remained perfectly still. It was as if time had frozen, leaving the two brothers standing alone in an aisle of silent, unmoving statues who were watching them. Then, in a coordinated movement that happened in less than a second, 6 of the passengers stood up. They did not look like civilians anymore. They pulled short-barreled submachine guns from beneath their seats and from the overhead bins. These were members of the KGB's elite Alpha group, and they had been sitting among the passengers since the flight began. The brothers were surrounded before they could even take a single step toward the cockpit of the jet aircraft. Raitt waved his device frantically, threatening to detonate it if they didn't back away. He was shouting about freedom and his right to leave the country, but his words were ignored. One of the agents stepped forward, his eyes as cold as the Arctic air outside. He didn't say a word, he just kept his weapon aimed directly at Raitt's chest. The realization that they had been betrayed by someone they loved hit Raitt harder than any physical blow could have in that moment. Eric began to cry, his homemade weapon falling from his trembling fingers and clattering onto the floor. He saw the grim faces of the agents and knew that their dream of Helsinki was dead. The cabin was suddenly filled with the sound of barking orders and the heavy stomping of boots. The other real passengers were being forced to put their hands behind their heads. The terror was absolute, a crushing weight that made it hard for the brothers to breathe in the cabin. One of the agents lunged forward and struck Raitt across the face with the butt of his gun. The world exploded into a burst of white light and red pain. Raitt fell back into his seat, his nose broken and his vision blurring. He felt the cold steel of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists. He looked at Eric, who was being pinned to the floor by 2 other men. They were being treated like dangerous terrorists, rather than 2 boys who just wanted to leave their country. The plane did not continue to Murmansk. It began a steep, banking turn that made the engines scream in protest. The pilot was following a direct order from the ground to return to Tallinn immediately. Raitt watched the white clouds through the window, knowing that they were headed back to the very prison they had tried so hard to escape. He felt a deep, hollow emptiness in his chest, a sense of failure that was far more painful than his physical injuries from the agent. The descent was fast and violent, the aircraft buffeted by the winds as it dropped toward the runway. When the wheels finally touched the ground, the brothers were dragged from their seats and thrown toward the exit. They could see a fleet of black sedans and military trucks waiting for them on the tarmac. Hundreds of armed soldiers were surrounding the plane, their bayonets gleaming in the dull afternoon light. There was no escape and no mercy for the 2 brothers. I have spent a lot of time looking into these old Soviet files, and there is a specific kind of sadness that comes from realizing how much these brothers truly loved each other. It is a detail that haunts me because their loyalty was the very thing that the state used to break them down. We like to think that courage is enough to win against an empire, but in this case, their bravery was simply the bait for a trap that had been set long before they ever bought a ticket. The forensic evidence gathered from the plane was used to build a case of high treason against the brothers. The state found the secret welding equipment and the maps they had hidden in their apartment. Every detail of their plan was laid out in a cold, clinical report that made their desperate hope look like a calculated act of war. The authorities made sure the trial was kept top secret to prevent the public from learning about the attempted escape from the country. After a brief and one-sided trial, Raitt and Eric were sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in the most brutal camps of Siberia. They were stripped of their citizenship, and their names were erased from the public record. For years, they survived on thin soup and heavy work, their bodies breaking down under the constant cold and the lack of food. They were rarely allowed to speak to each other, and the dream of Finland became a fading memory of a different life. In the independent and bustling streets of Tallinn today, in 2026, Rate has passed away, his health never recovering from the years spent in the camps. Eric is still alive, living a quiet and solitary life in a small village in Estonia. He rarely speaks about the hijacking, and he avoids the airport whenever possible. The friend who betrayed them was never officially identified, but Eric believes he knows who it was. The scars of that flight are still visible on his hands and in the way he looks at the sky. They spent years of their lives planning for a single moment of absolute freedom that was over before they could even finish their first sentence. They believed they were soaring toward a new life in the West, but in reality, they were just puppets in a theater of terror orchestrated by the men sitting in the rows behind them. When the smoke finally cleared on the runway, it became very clear that their flight had never even left the site of the control tower. The sky offers a promise of escape that is often nothing more than a cruel illusion designed to catch the desperate. For the brothers in Estonia, the altitude brought only a faster descent into the hands of their captors. But sometimes the most dangerous environments are not thousands of feet in the air, but deep in the humid jungles where the air is thick with the scent of money and blood. We are moving now from the cold north to the heat of the Golden Triangle. On the early morning of Friday, October 16, 1981, a 58-year-old drug lord named Kun Sa stood on the wooden balcony of his fortified villa in the remote village of Ban Hin Take. He looked out over the deep valley where the thick morning mist was clinging to the canopy of the jungle trees. The air was cool and carried the sharp scent of wood smoke and the faint, sweet aroma of raw opium being processed in the hills nearby. He sipped a hot tea, listening to the distant sound of his private army waking up in their barracks. To the outside world, he was the most dangerous narco-trafficker on the planet, but here in the Golden Triangle, he was a king in all but name. He wore a simple military tunic and moved with a calm confidence that suggested he was a man who had already survived 1,000 battles. He felt as if the entire mountain range belonged to him and him alone. Kun Sa had spent decades building the Mong Thai army into a force of over 10,000 soldiers who were loyal to him until death. He did not see himself as a criminal, but as a revolutionary fighting for the independence of the Shan people. He provided schools and hospitals for the local villagers who had been abandoned by the government. In their eyes, he was a savior who used the opium trade to fund their dream of a sovereign nation where they would finally be free. His wealth was almost beyond calculation, derived from the refined white heroin that flowed from his laboratories into the streets of New York and London. He lived in a state of absolute luxury, surrounded by fine silks and expensive alcohols that were smuggled across the border. He believed that his complex network of bribes and political connections made him untouchable. He felt that no government would ever dare to strike at his throne in the deep mountains. He was currently planning a massive expansion of his territory, hoping to unite all the ethnic groups of the region under his single banner. He envisioned a future where the Golden Triangle was an independent economic powerhouse that the rest of the world would have to respect. He spent his days reviewing maps and diplomatic messages from various rebel groups. He was convinced that he was the only man capable of bringing stability to this very chaotic part of the world. His relationship with his soldiers was deeply personal, as he knew most of the officers by name and treated them like his own sons. He often sat with them around the campfires, sharing stories of past victories and promising them a future where their children would not have to fight. This bond was the foundation of his power, a level of loyalty that could not be bought with money. He believed that his army would follow him into the very mouth of a fiery hell. On that particular morning, he was looking forward to a meeting with a high-level contact who was bringing news of a major heroin shipment that had successfully reached the coast. He was already thinking about how he would invest the millions of dollars in new weaponry and radio equipment for his border outposts. The sun was starting to burn through the fog, promising a beautiful and productive day for the empire he had built from nothing but poppy seeds. He had developed a very sophisticated system of early warning outposts that stretched for miles into the surrounding jungle. Every trail was monitored by men with radios who were instructed to report even the smallest movement of government troops. He believed that no force could ever approach Ban Hin Take without him knowing about it hours in advance. This confidence allowed him to sleep soundly at night, even with a multi-million-dollar bounty on his head. What most people did not realize was the extent of the bribery that Kun Sa had established across 3 different countries. He had officials on his payroll at every level of the military and the police, ensuring that he was always one step ahead of any planned operations. He saw these bribes as a necessary tax for doing business in a region where survival depended on knowing who to trust. He felt he had mastered the art of political survival in the jungle. The king of the jungle was admiring his poppy fields, blind to the thermal cameras, already tracking his heat signature from the clouds above. For the past 6 months, the Thai military had been working secretly with the American Drug Enforcement Administration to plan a strike of unprecedented scale. They had bypassed the local officials he had bribed and were using satellite imagery to track his movements. A massive task force was already moving through the jungle, bypassing his outposts in the dark. The soldiers moving toward his position were not the poorly trained conscripts he was used to fighting. They were elite paratroopers and border patrol police who had been trained specifically for mountain warfare. They were carrying heavy mortars and high-tech surveillance equipment that allowed them to see through the thickest canopy. The trap was not just being set, it was already closing around the village of Ban Hin Tek, while the king of opium was smiling. Kunsa set his cup down on the wooden railing and prepared to head inside to start his day. He was thinking about a new irrigation project for the poppy fields that would double his production in the coming season. He felt the warmth of the sun on his face and heard the sound of a distant waterfall. It was the last moment of peace he would ever experience in this home. The silence of the jungle was about to be shattered by a storm of steel and fire. A strange and sudden silence fell over the valley, as if every bird and insect had decided to hold its breath at the same time. Kunsa paused at his desk, a cold sensation crawling up his spine that he could not explain. He looked at the radio on his desk, but it remained silent. The air felt heavy and charged with static, and the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees in an instant. It was as if the jungle was trying to warn him of something coming for him. He heard a faint, rhythmic thumping in the distance that sounded like the beating of a giant heart. He told himself it was probably just a landslide in the northern hills, or perhaps the sound of a generator in the village. It happened all the time in the mountains, and there was no reason to be alarmed. He sat down and opened a ledger, trying to focus on his work. It was just the wind, he whispered to himself. It was always doing that in the high mountain passes. The scent of raw opium was suddenly replaced by a sharp, metallic smell that reminded him of burning magnesium. He stood up and went to the window, searching the horizon for any sign of smoke. The sunlight seemed to flicker for a second, and he felt a vibration in the floorboards that made the pens on his desk rattle. He shook his head and laughed at his own nerves. He was the king of the mountains, and nothing could reach him here without his permission. The first mortar shell struck the center of the military barracks with a deafening roar that shattered the windows of the villa. Kunsa was thrown against the wall as the floor buckled beneath him. Before he could even stand up, 3 more explosions rocked the village, sending plumes of black smoke and orange flame high into the air. The sound of screaming and the staccato rhythm of machine gun fire erupted from the jungle perimeter, surrounding him on all sides. He scrambled to his feet and grabbed a submachine gun from a wall rack, his mind racing to understand how his security had failed. He could see his soldiers running in every direction, trying to find cover as the sky began to rain fire. The Thai military had positioned heavy artillery on the ridges, overlooking the village, and they were systematically destroying every building. The air was filled with the sound of whizzing shrapnel and the heavy thud of falling debris. The heroin refineries on the edge of the village were the next to go, exploding in a series of massive chemical fires that turned the sky a sickly shade of green. Hundreds of kilograms of pure heroin were vaporized in seconds, sending a toxic cloud drifting over the battlefield. Kunsa watched as his life's work went up in smoke, his eyes stinging from the fumes. He realized that this was not a simple raid, but a full-scale military invasion designed to kill. He fought his way through the burning hallways of his villa, his elite guards falling around him as they were picked off by snipers hidden in the trees. The precision of the attack was terrifying, as the enemy seemed to know exactly where his command center was located. He felt a deep sense of betrayal as he realized that someone very close to him must have provided the coordinates. The heat from the fires was so intense that it felt like it was melting his skin. The battle moved into the streets of Ban Hin Tek, where the Mong Thai army attempted to make a stand against the advancing paratroopers. It was a chaotic and bloody fight, with hand-to-hand combat occurring in the very ruins of the schools and hospitals Kunsa had built. The air was so thick with dust and smoke that it was impossible to see more than a few feet in front of you. The sound of dying men and the roar of the flames created a symphony of horror. Suddenly, the sound of jet engines drowned out the gunfire as 2 Thai fighter jets screamed low over the valley. They dropped napalm on the jungle trails that Kunsa had planned to use for his escape, turning the forest into a wall of unquenchable fire. He was trapped in the center of the village, surrounded by the ruins of his empire and the bodies of his loyal soldiers. The reality of his situation was sinking in, and for the first time, he felt true terror. The fighting continued for several hours, with neither side showing any mercy. Kunsa managed to lead a small group of survivors toward a hidden tunnel that he had constructed for just such an emergency. They crawled through the dark, cramped passage, while the ground above them shook from the constant shelling. He could hear the muffled sounds of the village being torn apart, and he knew that everything he had built was being reduced to ash and rubble. When they finally emerged from the tunnel on the other side of the ridge, they looked back to see Ban Hintake engulfed in a massive pillar of black smoke. The village was gone, and with it the legend of the untouchable drug king. He had lost hundreds of his men and millions of dollars in inventory in a single afternoon. The forensic reports would later detail that the military seized over 500 tons of opium and heroin refining equipment during the raid. Kunsa did not wait to mourn his losses. He turned toward the dense jungle of the Myanmar border, knowing that his only hope for survival was to disappear into the shadows. He moved with a frantic energy, his fine military tunic torn and covered in soot. He was no longer a king, but a fugitive running for his life in a world that had suddenly turned against him. He could still hear the distant thud of the artillery as he plunged into the thick green canopy. The aftermath of the raid was a significant victory for international law enforcement as it disrupted the heroin trade for several years. Kunsa was eventually forced to surrender to the Myanmar government in 1996 after his army began to desert him. He was 63 years old at the time of his surrender and was allowed to live out his days in a comfortable villa in Yangon, where he was protected by the military leaders he had once bribed. Walking through the peaceful tea plantations of Ban Hintake in 2026, the village of Ban Hintake has been rebuilt and is now a peaceful farming community that produces tea instead of opium. Kunsa died of natural causes in 2007, and his burial was attended by thousands of former soldiers who still viewed him as a hero. The heroin trade has since moved to other regions, but the legend of the King of Opium remains a dark and fascinating chapter in the history of the Golden Triangle. He spent his entire life claiming that he was a liberator who was only trying to give his people a voice and a chance at independence. He built schools and hospitals and provided for those who had nothing, but he did it all on a foundation of human misery and addiction. In the end, his legacy was not the nation he dreamed of, but a path of destruction that stretched across the globe. He died in a bed of silk, far away from the violence he had spent his life creating. The smoke from the burning poppies in Ban Hintake eventually drifted away, leaving a void where a king once stood. While Kunsa was hiding in the jungle, halfway around the world, another purge was beginning in the dark alleys of Lebanon. Power is a fragile thing that can be snatched away by a rocket or a secret meeting in the dead of night. On the early morning of Sunday, July 7, 1980, a 32-year-old militia leader named Bashir Gemayel was quietly ordering his most elite units into the seaside town of Safra, Lebanon. He stood near the edge of the coastal road, watching the dark silhouettes of his Falangist gunmen move through the shadows toward the luxury apartments and beach clubs. The Mediterranean Sea was calm, its waves licking the shore with a rhythmic sound that masked the soft clicks of weapons. The town of Safra was a place of sun-drenched beauty, known for its golden beaches and the high-end resorts where the wealthy elite of Beirut fled to escape the heat of the civil war. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where the sounds of artillery were replaced by the laughter of families and the clinking of glasses. On this particular Sunday, the air was cool and salt-kissed, carrying the promise of a peaceful summer day for the hundreds of vacationers sleeping inside. In 1980, Lebanon was a mosaic of warring factions, but the people in Safra felt a unique sense of security. They were under the protection of the Tigers, the elite militia of the National Liberal Party. These men were seasoned fighters who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Bashir Gemayel's Falangists for years. They shared the same religion, the same neighborhoods, and the same goal of preserving their way of life against the chaos that was tearing the nation apart. Bashir Gemayel was a man possessed by a singular, burning vision of a unified Christian front. He was charismatic and ruthless, a leader who believed that the only way to save Lebanon was to bring every militia under his absolute and total command. He had spent months cultivating a public image of brotherhood and cooperation with the other leaders, frequently attending their family events and sharing meals at their tables to build a false sense of enduring trust and unity. His primary rival for leadership was a man named Danny Chamaun, the leader of the Tigers. Danny was the son of a former president and a man of great personal charm. He and Bashir had grown up in the same circles, and their families were deeply intertwined through decades of political alliances. They often referred to each other as brothers in arms, and their soldiers frequently trained together, sharing ammunition and cigarettes in the trenches of the war-torn city of Beirut. The Tigers felt so comfortable with their Falangist allies that they had let their guard down in Safra. Many of the militiamen were there on holiday with their wives and children, their weapons tucked away in closets or left in the trunks of their cars. They believed that the coastal town was a neutral zone where the political tensions of the city did not apply. They saw the Falangists as their ultimate safety net, the one group they would never have to worry about fighting. Bashir had spent the previous week carefully planning this operation, which he called the Day of the Long Knives. He knew the exact location of every Tiger commander's summer home and the layout of the barracks near the beach. He had ordered his men to use silencers whenever possible and to show no mercy to anyone wearing the Tiger insignia. He viewed this not as a betrayal, but as a surgical necessity to ensure the survival of his cause and his personal power. The bonding between the two groups was so strong that some of the Falangist soldiers felt a deep sense of unease as they approached the target houses. They were moving toward the homes of men they had joked with just days before, but the fear of Bashir was greater than their loyalty to their friends. They moved with a clinical efficiency, their faces hidden behind dark masks to avoid recognition. The air was thick with a tension that seemed to vibrate in the dark. They slept with their windows open to the sea breeze, never suspecting that the shadows moving in the garden were the very brothers they had invited for drinks the night before. Bashir had not just ordered a takeover of their offices, he had signed a death warrant for every single one of them. While they dreamed of a future where the war was over and their children were safe, their closest allies were standing outside their bedroom doors with loaded weapons. The bridge of brotherhood had already been burned to the ground. If you were standing on a balcony in Safra that morning, you would have felt the peaceful stillness of the dawn. You might have watched the light change on the surface of the water and felt a sense of gratitude for the quiet. You would have had no reason to suspect that the shadows moving between the villas were anything other than the morning breeze. The world felt perfectly in balance, right up until the moment the first door was kicked open by the masked intruders. The atmosphere in Safra shifted with a suddenness that was terrifying to those who were awake to witness it. The sound of the birds was abruptly cut short, replaced by the heavy, muffled thuds of suppressed gunfire. A strange, metallic smell began to drift through the alleyways, a mixture of cordite and salt air that signaled the beginning of the end. The shadows seemed to grow longer and darker, as if the sun itself was afraid to illuminate the streets of the town. You might have heard a faint scuffling sound on the roof above you, or the click of a latch being turned in the kitchen. You would have told yourself that it was just the wind, or perhaps a neighbor coming home late from a party. It was the kind of self-deception that comes from a deep need to believe that you are safe in your own sanctuary. You would have closed your eyes and tried to go back to sleep, ignoring the cold chill that was slowly filling the entire room. The silence was a weapon that Bashir used to maximize the confusion and the terror. There were no sirens and no shouted warnings to wake the town. The Falangists moved from house to house like ghosts, executing the Tiger commanders in their beds while their families watched in horror. The sensory experience of the massacre was one of intimate, close-range violence that left no room for escape. The victims realized the truth only in the final seconds of their lives. The dark spiral of the morning reached its peak as the Falangists moved toward the beach clubs where the younger Tigers were staying. The gunmen did not just target the fighters, they began to fire indiscriminately into the vacation cottages. The white sand of the beaches was soon stained with a deep, dark red that was washed away by the incoming tide. The screams of the dying were drowned out by the roar of the surf, creating a scene of absolute and total chaos. By the time the sun was fully above the horizon, the town of Safra had become a graveyard. Over 80 people had been murdered, many of them civilians who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Falangists then began a systematic search of the town, rounding up any survivors and forcing them to watch as the Tiger flags were torn down and burned. The betrayal was complete, and the unified Christian front was born in a pool of blood. The forensic evidence from the scene was a catalog of cold-blooded execution. Many of the victims were found with multiple gunshot wounds to the head and chest, delivered at point-blank range while they were still in their pajamas. The state of the bodies showed that there had been no struggle, no chance for the victims to defend themselves against their friends. The town that had once been a symbol of luxury and peace was now a site of one of the worst purges in history. I have spoken to people who survived that morning, and the detail that haunts them the most is the look in the eyes of the gunmen. They weren't looking at enemies, they were looking at targets on a checklist. The level of calculated detachment required to kill your own allies in such a manner is something that defies human emotion. It turned the Lebanese civil war into something even darker, proving that the most dangerous person is often the one standing right beside you. The aftermath of the Safra massacre was a seismic shift in the power structure of Lebanon. Bashir Gemayel had achieved his goal of total control, but he had done so at the cost of his soul and the trust of his people. Danny Chamaun managed to escape the town, but his militia was destroyed, leaving him a broken man. The unification of the militias did not bring the peace that Bashir had promised, but instead led to further escalations of violence and internal hatred. In 1982, Bashir Gemayel was elected president of Lebanon, but his triumph lasted only 21 days before he was killed by a massive bomb at his headquarters. The cycle of violence he had helped to accelerate eventually claimed his own life in the same brutal fashion he had inflicted on others. The Day of the Long Knives remained a dark stain on his legacy, a reminder that a house built on betrayal and blood can never stand for very long. At the sun-drenched beach resorts of Safra, as they stand in 2026, Safra has returned to being a peaceful coastal resort, but the locals still talk about the Sunday morning when the sea turned red. Many of the buildings from that era still stand, their walls patched and repainted to hide the bullet holes of the past. There is no official monument to the victims of the purge, as the political scars of the Civil War are still too sensitive to touch. The town carries its secrets in the silence of the early morning. The current status of the families involved is one of quiet mourning and a refusal to forget the names of those who were lost. The political landscape of Lebanon has changed many times since 1980, but the trauma of the Safra massacre remains a foundational memory for the community. It serves as a haunting reminder of what happens when ambition is allowed to override the sacred bonds of brotherhood and the basic humanity that should protect the innocent. The transition from a trusted ally to a cold-blooded killer is a shift that can happen in the time it takes to pull a trigger. Bashir Gemayel believed that his actions were necessary for the survival of his people, but he only succeeded in creating a legacy of fear and division. While he was consolidating his power through a massacre in Lebanon, another man of faith was preparing to face his own end in a very different kind of sanctuary on the other side of the world. The path from the blood-stained beaches of Safra to the quiet chapels of El Salvador is one paved with the bodies of those who dared to stand for something greater than themselves. Both stories involve the sudden and violent intrusion of politics into a sacred space, whether it be a vacation home or a house of God. As we leave the Mediterranean and look toward Central America, we see that the scent of incense is often replaced by the smell of gunpowder. They died by the hands of those they had invited for drinks the night before. On exactly 6:25 in the evening of Monday, March 24, 1980, a 62-year-old archbishop named Oscar Romero was standing behind the altar at the Divine Providence Hospital Chapel in San Salvador. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and the lingering smell of rubbing alcohol from the hospital corridors nearby. He was dressed in his formal white vestments, his hands resting gently on the edge of the marble altar as he prepared to conclude the Mass. The chapel was a modest and peaceful sanctuary, tucked away from the chaotic and blood-stained streets of the capital city. It was a place where the sick and the elderly came to find a moment of spiritual comfort amidst the growing violence of the Civil War. Through the open doors at the back of the chapel, the fading light of the sunset cast long and golden shadows across the stone floor. To the people gathered there, it felt like the only safe place left in the world. Oscar Romero was a man who had become the very soul of El Salvador during its darkest hour. He was not a radical by nature, but a quiet scholar who had been transformed by the suffering of his people. Every Sunday, his voice was broadcast across the nation on the radio, exposing the crimes of the military government and the death squads. He spoke for the mothers of the disappeared and the farmers who had been murdered in their fields for daring to ask for bread. He lived in a tiny apartment right next to the hospital, choosing to stay close to the poor and the dying rather than in the luxury of the cathedral. His life was a constant cycle of prayer, meetings with human rights activists, and visits to the most dangerous neighborhoods in the country. He knew that his name was at the top of every hit list in the nation, but he refused to carry a weapon or surround himself with armed guards. He believed his faith was his shield. His dream was for a nation where the law applied to everyone, regardless of their wealth or their military rank. He spent his nights writing letters to world leaders, pleading for them to stop sending weapons to the Salvadoran military. He envisioned a future where the children of the elite and the children of the peasants could sit in the same schools and eat from the same table. It was a simple and beautiful dream that made him the most dangerous man in the eyes of the state. The relationship between Romero and the common people was one of profound and unbreakable love. When he walked down the street, people would reach out just to touch the hem of his robe, looking at him as if he were a living saint. He knew their secrets, and he carried their grief in his own heart. He once told a reporter that if they killed him, he would rise again in the Salvadoran people, a prophecy that felt more like a promise to those who followed him. Every morning, he would sit in the hospital garden and listen to the birds, finding a brief moment of peace before the weight of his duties began. He enjoyed the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of the wind moving through the palm trees. These small details of life were precious to him, as he understood better than anyone how quickly they could be taken away. He cherished the quiet conversations with the nuns who ran the hospital, often laughing about his own clumsy nature. On this particular Monday, he had spent the afternoon preparing a sermon about the sacredness of human life. He had been feeling a strange sense of exhaustion lately, as if the burden of being the voice of the voiceless was finally starting to take its toll on his body. He looked at the crucifix on the wall of his office and felt a deep sense of calm. He knew that the threats against him were escalating, but he felt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He had received several anonymous phone calls that week, voices whispering that his time was running out. He did not tell his staff because he did not want to worry them. Instead, he spent more time in the chapel, finding comfort in the silence and the flickering light of the prayer candles. He felt that the darkness was closing in, but he was determined to keep the light of truth burning for as long as he possibly could. He was a man prepared for his own end. The chapel was filled with about 40 people that evening, mostly hospital patients in their robes and a few nuns. The atmosphere was intimate and quiet, with the only sound being the low murmur of Romero's voice as he read from the scriptures. He looked out at the familiar faces, many of whom he had comforted during their final hours. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for this small community that had become his family in the midst of the national storm. E was offering bread to the sick and the poor, while a red car parked on the street outside was offering a single, lead-tipped conclusion to his life. A red Volkswagen had been circling the hospital block for the last 20 minutes, its driver looking for the perfect spot to park. Inside the car was a professional marksman, a man who had been trained by the very military Romero had criticized. The sniper had a high-powered rifle resting on the back seat, hidden under a nondescript brown blanket and a pile of old newspapers. The marksman had chosen this moment specifically because the chapel doors were wide open to catch the evening breeze. He knew that from the sidewalk, he would have a clear and unobstructed line of sight to the man standing behind the altar. He moved with a clinical detachment, checking his watch and adjusting his mirror. To him, the archbishop was not a man of God, but a target on a list that had been signed by the highest powers in the Salvadoran government. The red car finally came to a stop just a few yards from the chapel entrance. The driver kept the engine running, a low and steady throb that was drowned out by the sound of the evening crickets. The sniper moved into the back, pushing the newspapers aside and resting the barrel of the rifle on the edge of the window. He took a slow breath and peered through the scope, the crosshairs settling directly on the small red circle of the archbishop's heart on his white chest. Romero reached for the chalice, his movements slow and deliberate. He was about to begin the final prayer of the Mass, a moment of profound spiritual connection. He looked up toward the back of the chapel, his eyes passing over the open doors and the street beyond. He felt a sudden and sharp chill, a sensation that the air in the room had shifted. He paused for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering over the silver cup, but he did not look away from the people. A strange and heavy silence descended upon the chapel, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The sound of the wind in the trees seemed to cut out entirely, and the golden light from the sunset took on a harsh and brittle quality. Romero felt a strange pressure against his chest, a weight that made it hard to draw a full breath. He told himself that it was just the heat of the day or the stress of the week finally catching up to his aging heart. He looked at the faces of the nuns in the front row and saw a flash of movement in the street behind them. He convinced himself that it was just a passing car or a neighbor returning home from work. There was no reason to fear a red Volkswagen in a city full of them. He took a deep breath and began to speak the words of the consecration, his voice steady and clear. "It is just the wind," he thought. "The wind always makes these old buildings creak in the evening." He reached out to raise the host toward the ceiling, his arms extended in a gesture of total surrender. In that moment, he was a perfect target, his body framed by the white marble of the altar. The self-deception of safety was the only thing that allowed him to finish the prayer. He believed that the sanctuary was a place where even his enemies would respect the presence of the divine. He was wrong. The darkness did not care about the sacredness of the space he inhabited. The sound of the shot was not a roar, but a sharp and singular crack that sounded like a heavy branch breaking in the woods. It echoed off the stone walls of the chapel and was followed by a terrifying and absolute silence. Romero did not move for a second, his arms still raised as if he were still praying. Then, a small and perfectly round hole appeared in the center of his white vestment, and a deep crimson stain began to spread across the fabric like an opening flower. The force of the bullet, which was designed to fragment upon impact, tore through his heart and lungs with a devastating efficiency. He collapsed backward, his body striking the floor with a heavy thud that made the candles on the altar flicker and die. The chalice fell from the altar, the wine spilling across the marble like a mirror of his own blood. The people in the chapel remained frozen in their seats, their minds unable to process the horror they had just witnessed. If you were standing in that front row, the smell of gunpowder would have reached you before the first scream. It was a sharp and acrid scent that cut through the lilies and the incense, a smell that belonged on a battlefield rather than a hospital chapel. The nuns were the first to move, rushing toward the fallen man and falling to their knees in the growing pool of blood. They tried to stem the flow with their veils, but they knew in an instant that it was already far too late. The red Volkswagen sped away from the curb, its tires screeching on the asphalt as it vanished into the gathering darkness of the city. The sniper did not look back, his mission accomplished with a single and professional shot. Behind him, the chapel had turned into a scene of absolute and total chaos. People were weeping and shouting, their voices rising in a discordant chorus of grief and anger that could be heard throughout the entire hospital complex that evening. The forensic evidence gathered later would show that the bullet was a .22 caliber round, specifically chosen for its ability to cause maximum internal damage without exiting the body. The trajectory of the shot was perfect, indicating a high level of training and a cold-blooded calm on the part of the shooter. The authorities would eventually link the weapon to a group of former military officers, but the investigation would be stalled by the government for decades. Romero's body was carried to the hospital's emergency room, but he was pronounced dead on arrival. The news spread through the city like a wildfire, and by nightfall, thousands of people had gathered outside the hospital in a silent and heartbroken vigil. They held candles and sang hymns, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames as they mourned the man who had been their only hope. The air in San Salvador was thick with the scent of rain and the heavy weight of a coming war. I have spent a lot of time reading the transcripts of Romero's final sermons, and there is a specific kind of bravery in knowing you are going to die and choosing to speak anyway. He didn't have a weapon, he didn't have an army, he only had his words. And in the end, those words were so powerful that they had to be silenced with a bullet. The detail that haunts me most is that he was killed while talking about the importance of not killing each other in the street. The aftermath of the assassination was a descent into a total and brutal civil war that would last for 12 long years. The funeral of the archbishop was itself attacked by the military, with bombs and gunfire turning the cathedral square into a killing field. Over 30 people were killed during the service, their bodies piled up on the very steps where they had come to honor their leader. The nation had lost its moral compass, and the violence became the only language left. The offender profile for this crime points directly to Roberto de Abuison, the founder of the Arena Party and the leader of the death squads. He was a man who viewed any talk of human rights as a communist threat that had to be eliminated. Although a United Nations Truth Commission later found him responsible for ordering the hit, he was never brought to justice in a court of law. He died of cancer in 1992, taking the full details of the conspiracy to his grave. Stepping into the quiet hospital chapel that has become a shrine in 2026, Oscar Romero has been officially recognized as a saint by the Catholic Church. His tiny apartment has been turned into a museum, and the chapel where he fell is now a site of pilgrimage for people from all over the world. The red Volkswagen was never found, and the marksman who pulled the trigger has never been publicly identified. The Civil War ended in 1992, but the scars of that era are still visible in every corner of El Salvador today. The current status of the country is one of a fragile and difficult peace, with a new generation trying to build the nation that Romero once envisioned. His image can be found on murals and in homes across the country, a reminder that while you can kill a man, you cannot kill the truth he stood for. The blood on the chapel floor was eventually scrubbed away, but the memory of that evening is etched into the soul of the nation, a dark and permanent shadow. The bullet did not just kill a man, it shattered the last remaining hope for peace in an entire nation. The transition from the blood of a martyr in El Salvador to the high-stakes corruption of the Soviet Union is a journey across the ideological fault lines of the 20th century. While Romero was dying for the poor, others were building empires of greed and deception behind the Iron Curtain. Power is a currency that can be spent on salvation or on the finest black caviar that money can buy. We are moving now from the sacred silence of a chapel to the noisy markets of Moscow. The weight of a single life can balance the scales of history, whether it is an archbishop in a chapel or a government official with a secret in his briefcase. Both worlds are defined by the choices made in the dark, and both are subject to the same sudden and violent corrections of fate. As we leave the heat of Central America and enter the cold corridors of the Kremlin, we see that the scent of incense is often replaced by the smell of fish and the taste of betrayal. In the late afternoon of a Tuesday in May 1980, inside a quiet and wood-paneled office on the fourth floor of the Ministry of Fisheries in Moscow, a 53-year-old man named Vladimir Raitov was leaning back in his heavy leather chair. The room smelled of expensive tobacco and the faint, salty tang of preserved seafood that seemed to cling to the very walls of the building. He was reviewing a series of export ledgers that sat on his desk, his fingers moving with a slow and steady rhythm. Vladimir was the Deputy Minister of Fisheries, a position of immense power in a country where food was more valuable than gold. He was a man who moved with a slow and calculated confidence, his suits tailored from the finest wool imported from the West. He looked out the window at the gray skyline of the city, feeling like he was the master of the deep seas that fed the nation. He believed his position was as solid as the foundation of the Kremlin, and his power was absolute. The world of Vladimir Raitov was one of absolute privilege and secret abundance, hidden behind the drab gray walls of the Soviet bureaucracy. While the average citizen spent their days standing in long, exhausting lines for a single loaf of bread or a liter of thin milk, Vladimir had access to everything the world had to offer. He was the architect of the Okean fish store chain, a project that was supposed to bring the bounty of the sea to every dinner table in the Soviet Union. The Okean stores were a source of great national pride, featuring massive glass tanks filled with live fish and shelves stocked with colorful cans. For the common person, walking into an Okean store felt like stepping into a dream of the future. The bright lights and the smell of fresh water were a sharp contrast to the crowded and dim state markets. Raitov was celebrated as a hero of the people, a man who had successfully modernized the way the entire nation ate. He lived in a massive apartment in a building reserved for the highest party members, where the hallways were carpeted in red and the elevators always worked. His children wore denim jeans and listened to rock music on expensive stereos that had been smuggled in from West Germany. He felt that he was living the life he deserved, a reward for the long years he had spent climbing the dangerous ladder of the Soviet hierarchy. He was a man who had reached the very top. Raitov spent his weekends at a private dacha in the countryside, where he hosted elaborate dinner parties for his fellow ministers. They would sit on the terrace, drinking fine cognac and eating delicacies that were officially forbidden to the public. They laughed about the quotas and the 5-year plans, knowing that they were the ones who truly controlled the flow of goods. He felt a deep sense of camaraderie with these men, believing they were all part of a special club. His work allowed him to travel to foreign ports, where he was greeted with the respect usually reserved for a head of state. He enjoyed the luxury hotels of Europe and the expensive gifts that foreign businessmen would give him to secure favorable trade deals. He saw himself as a sophisticated man of the world, someone who was far above the petty concerns of the working class. He believed that he was essential to the survival of the state, and therefore he was above the law. The Okean chain was expanding every month, with new locations opening from the Baltic coast to the Pacific shore. Raitov was constantly reviewing architectural plans and supply chain reports, ensuring that every store reflected the glory of the party. He was a master of the system, knowing exactly which officials to bribe and which ones to threaten to keep his empire growing. He felt that he had built something that would last long after he was gone from the ministry. What most people did not realize was that Rytov viewed the entire fishing industry as his own private bank account. He saw the vast resources of the ocean not as a way to feed the hungry, but as a way to fund his own personal luxuries. He had developed a complex system of shadow accounting that allowed him to divert millions of rubles into his own pockets. He was a man of cold logic who believed that everyone had a price and everything could be bought for a cost. He often sat in his office late at night, staring at the maps of the world's oceans and calculating the potential profit of every catch. He felt a sense of ownership over the thousands of fishing vessels that roamed the seas under the Soviet flag. To him, the sailors were just numbers on a page, and the fish were just a currency to be traded for power. He was a man who had replaced his conscience with a calculator, and he was very satisfied with the current results. His relationship with his wife was one of shared ambition and a mutual love for the finer things in life. She spent her days shopping at the secret stores reserved for the elite, buying French perfumes and Italian leather shoes. They rarely spoke about the details of his work, as they both understood that some things were better left unsaid. They were a golden couple of the Soviet elite, appearing at every major gala and opera performance with a smile of total confidence. Rytov felt that he had mastered the art of survival in the dangerous waters of Moscow politics. He knew where all the bodies were buried, and he had files on every one of his rivals. He believed that his knowledge made him untouchable, a man who was too important to be brought down. He ignored the whispers of reform and the growing frustration of the public, convinced that the system would always protect its own. He was a man who had forgotten the meaning of fear. On this particular afternoon, he was reviewing a plan to export a massive shipment of Atlantic herring to several Western countries. He was pointing at the delivery schedules on his desk, his gold pen catching the light from the window. He was smiling because he knew that this specific deal would net him enough money to buy a new villa on the Black Sea. The world felt like it was perfectly in balance, right up until the moment he heard the sound of the heavy boots. He was enjoying the scent of expensive tobacco, while a simple can of fish in a small KGB kitchen was already exhaling the smell of his absolute downfall. One of his store managers in a small city had recently made a very simple and very human mistake. He had sold a can of Atlantic herring to a low-ranking officer of the KGB who was just looking for a quick dinner. When the officer opened the can at his kitchen table, he did not find fish, but something much darker and much more valuable inside the tin. The knock on the door of Vladimir's office was not loud, but it had a specific weight to it that made the pens on his desk rattle. He felt a sudden and sharp drop in the temperature of the room, as if the heaters had all been turned off at once. The light from the window seemed to take on a pale and sickly yellow hue. He told himself it was just a scheduled meeting with the auditing committee, a routine part of his job. He leaned over to adjust his tie in the mirror. He felt a strange and heavy pressure against his chest, a weight that made it hard to draw a full breath into his lungs. He convinced himself that it was just the stress of the week, or perhaps the heavy meal he had eaten for lunch. There was no reason to fear a knock on the door in his own ministry building. He took a deep breath and smoothed the front of his expensive wool suit, preparing to welcome his visitors with a smile. "It is just the wind," he thought to himself. The door opened, and 3 men in long dark coats stepped into the room. They did not offer a handshake, and they did not look at the fine art on the walls. They moved with a clinical and methodical speed, surrounding his desk before he could even stand up. Vladimir felt a bead of cold sweat crawl down his spine, but he maintained a mask of calm. He told them that there must be some sort of misunderstanding and that he would call the minister to clear it up now. The investigators ignored his protests and began to pull the ledgers from the shelves. They were not looking for fish counts or fuel reports. They were looking for the secret marks he had made in the margins. One of the men pulled a small can from his pocket and placed it on the desk between them. It was a can of Okean Atlantic herring, but when the investigator pulled the tab, the room was filled with the rich and unmistakable scent of high-grade black caviar. The secret was out in the open, literally sitting on his desk. For years, Rytov had been running a massive smuggling operation where premium caviar was packed into cheap herring cans and shipped abroad. The difference in price was staggering, and the profits were being split between Rytov and over 200 other officials across the country. The herring can was the key to a conspiracy that had stolen hundreds of millions of rubles from the Soviet people for years. The investigators found a hidden safe behind a portrait of Lenin, filled with foreign currency and gold bars. They found the account numbers for Swiss banks and the names of the Western businessmen who were helping to move the illegal goods. Vladimir watched as his life's work was dismantled in a matter of minutes. He realized that the system he had served so faithfully was now the very thing that was going to destroy him to save its own reputation from the public. The news of the fish mafia scandal broke across the Soviet Union like a thunderclap. The public was horrified to learn that while they were starving, their leaders were getting rich by selling the nation's most precious resources. The Okean stores, once a symbol of pride, became a symbol of the deepest betrayal. The state began a massive purge of the Ministry of Fisheries, arresting hundreds of people in a desperate attempt to show that they were taking the crime seriously. Raitov was taken to the Lefortovo prison, a place where the lights never went out and the sound of the guards' boots was the only music. He was subjected to months of intense and grueling interrogation, with the KGB special investigators demanding the names of everyone involved. He felt a deep sense of betrayal as he realized that none of his powerful friends were coming to save him. He was alone in the dark, a man who had everything and now had absolutely nothing at all. The trial was a cold and clinical affair, held in a secret military court to prevent any further public embarrassment for the party. Raitov sat in the glass cage, his expensive suit now wrinkled and his face pale from the lack of sunlight. He tried to argue that he was just a cog in a much larger machine, but the state was not interested in excuses. They needed a villain to blame for the food shortages and the economic collapse, and Vladimir Raitov was the perfect man. He spent his final days writing long letters to his family, pleading for their forgiveness and trying to explain why he had done what he did. He spoke of the pressures of the system and the seductive power of the wealth he had discovered, but his words were never delivered, and his family was stripped of their home and their status. They were forced to move into a small communal apartment in a distant city, where they lived in fear of being recognized by their neighbors. In 1982, the court handed down its final verdict. Vladimir Raitov was found guilty of high treason and economic crimes against the state. He was sentenced to death by firing squad, a punishment that was reserved for the most serious of offenses. He was taken to a small room in the basement of the prison, where he was told to kneel on a piece of plastic sheeting. He did not cry, and he did not scream. He simply closed his eyes and waited for the darkness. Inside the high-tech and globalized supermarkets of Moscow in 2026, the Okean fish stores have largely disappeared from the Russian landscape, replaced by modern supermarkets that sell goods from all over the world. The Ministry of Fisheries has undergone dozens of reorganizations, but the memory of the caviar scandal remains a dark chapter in the history of the Soviet era. Raitov's name is rarely mentioned in the official history books, and his family has faded into the total obscurity of the forgotten past. The vast fortune he built from the sea was seized by the state and vanished into the government vaults, never to be seen again. The luxury villas and the expensive cars were sold at auction, and the secret bank accounts were closed. The hero of the fishing industry is now just a footnote in a long list of men who believed they could outsmart the system. The ocean continues to provide its bounty, but the man who tried to own it all is nothing more than a ghost now. The people of Moscow continued to stand in lines for hours just to get a piece of spoiled fish, never knowing that their deputy minister was getting rich by selling their heritage to the highest bidder. He believed that he was smarter than the system that created him, but in the end, the system devoured him just as easily as it devoured everyone else. The people queued for spoiled fish while officials ate caviar with gold spoons, and his power vanished in a single shot. The betrayal of a nation's trust is a crime that leaves a permanent scar on the soul of a country, whether it happens in the cold markets of Moscow or the dry deserts of South America. While Raitov was hiding his wealth in shoeboxes, another group of men in Chile were planning a heist that would reveal the true nature of the secret police under Pinochet. We are moving from the deep sea to the burning sands of the Atacama for the next story of the night. On the morning of Monday, March 9, 1981, two bank employees named Gabriel Hernandez and Milton Iturra were preparing to leave their office at the state bank in the small town of Calama, Chile. The air was already beginning to shimmer with the intense heat of the Atacama Desert, and the scent of dry dust and old paper filled the cramped back room where they worked. They were counting several stacks of 50-peso bills into canvas bags. Gabriel was a 44-year-old cashier with a kind smile and a reputation for being meticulous with his ledgers. Milton was just 25, a young man who had recently started his career and was eager to prove his worth to the bank management. They were tasked with transporting 45 million pesos to a nearby mining outpost, a routine mission that usually took less than 2 hours. 2 hours. They felt a sense of pride in being trusted with such a huge sum of money. The town of Kalama was a rugged place, built on the edge of the driest desert on Earth and surrounded by massive copper mines that fueled the entire nation's economy. It was a community of hard-working people who lived by the rhythms of the sun and the shifting sands. Gabriel and Milton were well-liked members of this community, the kind of men who would stop to help a neighbor fix a flat tire or share a cold drink on a particularly hot afternoon in the plaza. Gabriel had been working at the bank for over 15 years and was looking forward to a long-awaited vacation with his wife and 3 children. He had saved every spare peso to take them to the coast, where the air was cool and the ocean was blue. He spent his lunch breaks looking at brochures of beach resorts and dreaming of the feeling of sand between his toes. He wanted to give his family a memory that would last a lifetime after a very long year of hard work. Milton was a different story, a young man who was just starting to build a life with his new fiancée. They had recently found a small house on the outskirts of town and were spending their weekends painting the walls and fixing the garden. He was a man of simple dreams, wanting nothing more than a stable job and a happy home for the family he hoped to start very soon. He looked up to Gabriel as a mentor and a friend who had shown him the ropes of the banking world. The relationship between the 2 men was one of mutual respect and a shared sense of duty. They often joked about the weight of the money they handled every day, though they knew they would never touch a single cent of it for themselves. On this specific morning, they were laughing about a local soccer match while they loaded the heavy canvas bags into the back of a nondescript transport van. They felt completely safe because of the armed guards standing nearby. The guards were not just regular security, they were agents of the CNI, the feared secret police of the Pinochet regime. In Chile during the early 1980s, these men were the ultimate authority, tasked with maintaining order and hunting down enemies of the state. Gabriel and Milton felt a deep sense of security, knowing that such powerful men were protecting them and the bank's assets. They believed that no criminal would ever dare to attack a secret police car. The air in the back of the van was hot and smelled of canvas and oil, but the 2 bank employees didn't mind the discomfort. They were used to the harsh conditions of the desert and were focused on getting the job done so they could return home for dinner. Gabriel checked his gold watch, a gift from his father, and noted that they were exactly on schedule. He felt a sense of satisfaction in his work, believing that he was a vital part of the nation's financial heart. They were joking about soccer in the weekend, completely unaware that the men in the front seat were already scouting for a quiet spot to dig their desert graves. The CNI agents who were supposed to be their protectors had been planning this heist for over 3 months. They didn't want the money for the state or for some secret operation. They wanted it to fund their own private lives of luxury and excess. The 2 bank employees were not passengers in their eyes, they were just loose ends. The lead agent was a man named Gabriel Hernandez, a coincidence of names that would later haunt the investigators. He was a cold and calculating operative who had spent years in the shadows of the regime, learning how to make people disappear without leaving a trace. He had recruited several other agents to join him in the plot, promising them a share of the 45 million pesos. To them, the lives of 2 humble bank employees were worth less than a stack of bills. They had chosen a specific spot in the desert, miles away from the main road, where the ground was hard and the wind would quickly cover any signs of a struggle. They had prepared several blocks of dynamite, the same kind used in the copper mines, to ensure that no evidence would ever be found by the local police. They moved with a clinical detachment, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses that reflected the harsh sun of the Atacama. It was a perfect plan for them. Gabriel and Milton sat in the back of the van, unaware of the conversations happening in the front cabin. They were talking about the upcoming Independence Day celebrations and the traditional food they hoped to eat. The hum of the engine was a comforting sound, a constant reminder that they were moving toward their destination. They felt a sense of camaraderie with the guards, occasionally offering them a piece of gum or a friendly comment through the small metal grate. The vast expanse of the desert stretched out in every direction, a landscape of orange sand and black rocks that seemed to go on forever. It was a beautiful and terrifying place, where the silence was so absolute that you could hear the blood pumping in your own ears. The 2 men felt a sense of awe at the scale of the world around them, a reminder of how small their own lives were in comparison. They felt a deep connection to the land that had sustained their town. As the van approached a fork in the road, the driver did not take the usual path toward the mining outpost. Instead, he turned onto a narrow dirt track that led deep into the uninhabited wasteland of the desert. Gabriel noticed the change and asked the guard why they were taking a detour. The guard told him that there was a report of a protest on the main road and they were taking a safer route. Gabriel nodded, trusting the expert advice of the secret police officer. He leaned back against the canvas bags, feeling a slight sense of unease but quickly dismissing it as nerves. He told himself that these men knew what they were doing and that his safety was their primary concern. Milton was already drifting off to sleep, his head resting against the metal wall of the van. The world felt perfectly in balance, a quiet morning in the desert that was supposedly like any other. They were just two men doing their jobs in a difficult world. The self-deception of the two employees was their only protection against the growing darkness of the situation. They wanted to believe in the system and the men who represented it, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. They closed their eyes and let the motion of the van lull them into a false sense of security. They were moving toward their final destination, a place where the law of the state would be replaced by the law of the deep desert sand. The van came to a sudden stop in a shallow depression between two large sand dunes. The sound of the engine dying was followed by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. A hot wind began to howl around the corners of the vehicle, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of industrial explosives. Gabriel felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach, a feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this quiet desert detour. He looked at Milton, who was now wide awake and looking around with a confused expression. They heard the sound of the front doors opening and the heavy thud of boots on the dry ground. A strange chemical smell began to fill the back of the van, a scent that Gabriel recognized from his visits to the mines, but could not quite place in this context. He told himself it was just the smell of the truck's exhaust, or perhaps a nearby mining operation in the empty area. The back doors of the van were flung open, and the harsh light of the noon sun blinded the two men for a moment. Instead of a friendly hand to help them down, they were met with the muzzles of submachine guns. The CNI agents did not say a word, their faces expressionless as they ordered the bank employees out into the sand. Gabriel felt the heat of the desert air on his face, but his heart was cold with the realization that they were never going back home to their families. They were marched several hundred yards away from the van, their boots sinking deep into the soft orange sand. The agents moved with a clinical speed, their weapons trained on the backs of the two men. Gabriel tried to speak, to ask what they wanted or to offer them the money in exchange for their lives, but his voice was caught in his dry throat. He looked at Milton and saw the absolute terror in the young man's eyes, a look that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The agents forced them to kneel in the dirt, their hands behind their heads. The lead agent stepped forward and looked at Gabriel, his namesake, with a look of pure indifference. He didn't see a human being with a family and dreams. He only saw a witness that needed to be eliminated. The sound of the wind was the only thing that could be heard as the agent raised his pistol and took aim. The sun was at its highest point in the sky, casting no shadows on the ground. The first shot was a sharp crack that echoed off the distant hills and was swallowed by the vastness of the desert. Gabriel fell forward into the sand, his father's gold watch catching the light one last time. Milton tried to run, but he didn't make it more than 3 steps before another volley of gunfire cut him down. The two bank employees lay still on the ground, their blood soaking into the dry earth as the CNI agents stood over them with their smoking weapons. The agents did not stop there, as they needed to ensure that the bodies would never be identified if they were ever found. They dragged the remains into a nearby cave and began to set up the dynamite they had brought from the town. They moved with the same methodical speed they had used throughout the entire operation, connecting the wires and checking the fuses. They were experts in destruction, and they were about to erase every trace of their horrific desert crime. The explosion was a massive roar that shook the entire valley and sent a plume of dust and debris hundreds of feet into the air. The cave collapsed in on itself, burying the remains of Gabriel and Milton under tons of rock and sand. The agents watched the dust settle with a sense of grim satisfaction, believing that they had committed the perfect crime. They returned to the van and began to load the 45 million pesos into their own private vehicles in the desert. They drove back to Calama in separate directions, each man carrying a share of the stolen money. They arrived home in time for dinner, acting as if they had just finished a routine day of work for the state. They spent the next few weeks spending the money on expensive jewelry and luxury goods, convinced that the disappearance of the bank employees would be blamed on a local gang or a terrorist group. They felt completely and utterly untouchable in their secret power. But the desert has a way of revealing secrets that men try to hide. A few months later, a group of local miners were exploring the hills near the site of the explosion and found a small piece of metal glinting in the sun. It was the backplate of a gold watch, partially melted and twisted by the blast. On the inside was a simple inscription for Gabriel on his 10th anniversary at the bank. The miners knew something was wrong and called the local police station immediately. The investigation was initially blocked by the CNI, who claimed that the site was a restricted military zone. But the evidence of the watch and the disappearance of the bank employees had created a wave of public outrage that could not be ignored even by the dictatorship. A brave judge began to dig into the records of the secret police and found that the agents assigned to the transport had suddenly come into a vast amount of wealth without any logical explanation. The forensic team eventually excavated the site of the explosion and found the small fragments of bone and clothing that had survived the blast. The state of the remains was horrific, a testament to the brutality of the men who were supposed to be the nation's guardians. The discovery of the dynamite wrappers, which were traced back to a specific military depot, provided the final link between the crime and the agents of the feared CNI secret police organization. The lead agent was arrested while he was trying to flee the country with his family. He eventually confessed to the entire plot, providing the names of his accomplices and the details of the execution in the desert. He showed no remorse for his actions, claiming that he was a soldier doing what was necessary to survive in a difficult world. The trial was a rare public exposure of the criminal nature of the intelligence apparatus under the Pinochet regime in Chile. The public was shocked to learn that the men they were told to trust were actually a gang of common thieves and murderers. The scandal was so immense that it forced a reorganization of the CNI and led to the first major cracks in the absolute power of the military government. The families of Gabriel and Milton were finally given the truth, though it was a truth that offered very little comfort after so many months of agonizing silence and the lack of a proper body. The aftermath of the Calama heist was a turning point for the nation of Chile. The two lead agents were eventually sentenced to death and executed by firing squad in 1982, a move by Pinochet to distance himself from the scandal. It was the last time the death penalty was carried out in the country before it was eventually abolished. The stolen money was never fully recovered, with millions of pesos having vanished into the hands of the rogue agents. Out in the silent, shimmering heat of the Atacama Desert in 2026, the state bank in Calama still stands, though the security protocols have been completely overhauled. A small memorial plaque for Gabriel Hernandez and Milton Iturra has been placed in the lobby, a quiet reminder of the men who lost their lives in the line of duty. The agents who were involved in the heist are either dead or serving life sentences in special prisons for human rights violators, their names forever linked to the desert crime. The Atacama Desert remains a place of silent beauty and hidden secrets, its orange sands hiding the scars of a violent past. The families of the victims still gather every year on the anniversary of the disappearance to light candles and remember the men they loved. The legacy of the Calama heist is one of a mafia state being exposed by its own greed, a reminder that even the most powerful secret police cannot hide their crimes from the light of the desert sun. Those men believed that by blowing the bodies into 1,000 pieces, they were erasing the sin of their actions. They thought they could kill the truth with fire and rock, but the desert had other plans for them. In the end, it was a tiny piece of gold that brought an entire empire of terror to its knees. Those who were paid to protect the weak were the ones who became the monsters. They died in the sand because of the very greed they tried to hide in the deep dark. The shift from a desert execution to a mysterious plane crash over a mountain is a journey between two different types of silence. While the sands of Chile revealed the truth through a golden watch, the jungles of Panama would keep their secrets buried under the wreckage of an aircraft. Power can be taken by a bullet or by a sudden failure in the high clouds. We are moving from the heat of the Atacama to the fog of the mountain of Marta for the next story. On the morning of Friday, July 31st, 1981, a 52-year-old leader named Omar Torrijos was walking toward a twin-engine aircraft on the tarmac of an airfield in Peñonome, Panama. He was dressed in his signature military fatigues, carrying a small leather bag and a folder of documents for a meeting in the village of Coclacito. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the heavy, approaching tropical rain of the afternoon. The aircraft was a de Havilland Canada Twin Otter, carrying the tail number FAP 205. It was a rugged plane designed for the difficult terrain of the Panamanian mountains. Torrijos climbed into the cabin and sat in his usual seat just behind the pilot, nodding to the two crew members he had trusted with his life for years. The engines coughed into life, sending a spray of fine mist across the windshield as they prepared for their takeoff. Omar Torrijos was the man who had become the beating heart of Panama during a time of great international tension. He was not a traditional politician, but a soldier who had risen to power with a vision of a nation that was truly independent and free. He was most famous for negotiating the return of the Panama Canal, a feat that had earned him the undying love of the rural poor. To them, he was more than a general. He was a protector and a true national hero. His life was dedicated to visiting the small, forgotten villages in the interior of the country, where he would sit on the ground and listen to the problems of the farmers. He preferred the smell of wood smoke and the taste of black coffee in a peasant's hut over the luxury of the presidential palace. He believed that the strength of Panama lay in its people, and he spent every waking hour trying to build schools and roads where there had once been only jungle. His future plans were ambitious, as he wanted to turn the Canal Zone into a hub of education and technology for all of Latin America. He envisioned a future where the youth of Panama would not have to leave their homes to find a better life. He spent hours at night reviewing blueprints for new universities and research centers, his eyes glowing with the excitement of a man who knew he was building a legacy. He felt that his work was only just beginning to bear fruit. The relationship he had with his children was one of deep tenderness and shared dreams. He would often take them on his trips to the countryside, wanting them to see the reality of the nation they were born into. He taught them to respect the labor of the farmer and the wisdom of the elders. On that morning in July, he had promised his youngest daughter that they would go fishing together as soon as he returned from his brief meeting in the mountains. His personal habits were simple, and he was known for his love of fine cigars and the long walks he would take in the forest to clear his mind. He was a man who felt a deep connection to the land of Panama, often saying that he could feel the pulse of the earth under his boots. He moved with a quiet energy that commanded respect without the need for shouting. He felt completely at home in the humidity and the wild green landscape of the northern provinces. The weather report that morning had mentioned a few scattered showers, but nothing that would ground a pilot with thousands of hours of experience in the region. Torrijos looked out the window as the plane climbed above the trees, watching the silver ribbons of the rivers winding through the jungle below. He felt a sense of peace that always came to him when he was in the air, away from the noise of the city and the endless demands of the various diplomats. His security detail was managed by a man he trusted implicitly, a high-ranking officer named Manuel Noriega. Noriega was known for his cold efficiency and his ability to handle the delicate intelligence matters of the state. He had personally inspected the aircraft and the flight plan before the general arrived at the airfield. Torrijos felt that he was in good hands, believing that the loyalty of his officers was the foundation of his safety and his power. The pilot of FAP 205 was a veteran of the Panamanian Air Force who had flown through some of the worst storms in history. He checked the gauges on the instrument panel, his hands moving with a fluid grace born of decades of practice. He knew every mountain peak and every valley in the Coco province by heart. He felt a deep sense of responsibility for the man sitting behind him, and he was determined to provide the smoothest flight possible. The general was reviewing plans for the future of his people, while a mechanical shadow was being meticulously placed inside the belly of his aircraft. Hidden within the complex wiring of the aircraft's navigation system was a small device that had not been there 24 hours earlier. It was designed to trigger a catastrophic failure at a specific altitude and pressure. While the general was looking at his documents, a silent countdown was already nearing its end in the belly of the plane. The altitude of the aircraft began to fluctuate as they entered a thick bank of white clouds near the Marta mountain range. The pilot adjusted the throttle, feeling a slight vibration in the control yoke that he had never felt before. He looked at the co-pilot, who was also checking the engine temperatures and the fuel pressure. They both assumed it was just a bit of turbulence from the rising heat of the jungle, a common occurrence during the rainy season. The fog began to close in around the cockpit, turning the world into a featureless gray void that seemed to press against the glass. The visibility dropped to near zero in a matter of seconds, leaving the pilot to rely entirely on his instruments to navigate the narrow passes between the peaks. He felt a sudden drop in the air temperature inside the cabin, and the smell of ozone filled the small space. He told himself that he had handled worse conditions before. Self-deception is a powerful tool when you are flying through a mountain range in the dark. The pilot convinced himself that they were still on the correct heading and that the mountain peaks were at least 500 feet below their current position. He believed that the radar would have warned him if they were approaching an obstacle. He did not realize that the instruments were already giving him false readings, leading him directly into the side of the mountain. They entered a pocket of high pressure that made the engine scream in a high-pitched tone that was almost like a human wail. Torrijos looked up from his folder, sensing that something was wrong with the rhythm of the flight. He saw the pilot struggling with the controls, his knuckles white and his face pale with concentration. The air in the cabin was suddenly filled with the scent of burning electrical insulation and the sharp metallic tang of hydraulic fluid. The silence that followed the sudden engine failure was the most terrifying sound the general had ever heard. It was an absolute and heavy quiet that lasted for only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. He looked out the window and saw a wall of solid green leaves rushing toward the aircraft at an incredible speed. There was no time to scream or to pray. There was only the cold realization that the ground was no longer where it was supposed to be in the sky. The impact on the steep slope of Marta Mountain was so violent that the aircraft was torn into 3 distinct sections in less than a second. The fuel tanks exploded in a massive fireball that turned the trees into pillars of flame and sent a plume of black smoke into the gray sky. The sound of the crash was swallowed by the thick forest, and the remains of FAP 205 settled into the mud and the ferns of the remote and uninhabited jungle. The search for the missing aircraft did not begin for several hours, as the radio silence was initially blamed on the bad weather in the province. Manuel Noriega took personal command of the search and rescue operations, but he curiously directed the teams toward a valley miles away from the actual crash site. It was as if he wanted to ensure that no survivors would be found before the fire had finished its work. The delay was critical and very suspicious. When the wreckage was finally located 2 days later, there was nothing left but twisted metal and ash. The recovery teams found that the flight recorder was mysteriously missing, and the engine parts had been scattered over a wide area. Noriega arrived at the scene in a helicopter and immediately ordered the area to be cordoned off by his elite troops. He did not allow the civilian investigators to examine the site until all the sensitive pieces were gone. As I look at the history of Panama, I find it hard to ignore the convenience of this accident for certain powerful interests. It is a detail that haunts me because a man like Torrijos was a major obstacle for those who wanted to control the wealth of the canal. We often see these sudden failures in the lives of leaders who dare to stand up for their people. It makes you wonder if the mountain was the real enemy, or if the danger had been sitting right beside him. The forensic evidence that was eventually leaked suggested that the engines were at full power at the moment of impact, which contradicted the official report of mechanical failure. This indicated that the pilot was trying to climb away from an obstacle he could not see on his instruments. The claim made by John Perkins that Torrijos was a target for an economic hitman began to gain traction among the public, as it explained the various strange anomalies of the case. The interest of the United States in the crash was immediate, as the death of Torrijos changed the entire political landscape of Central America. With him gone, the treaties he had negotiated were suddenly under threat of being renegotiated or ignored by the next administration. The man who had been the primary negotiator for the return of the canal was no longer there to protect the interests of his people. The political vacuum was filled by chaos and fear. The immediate aftermath was a period of intense mourning and confusion for the nation of Panama. People stood in the rain for days, waiting for news of their leader, hoping for a miracle that never came. When the death was finally confirmed, the country fell into a state of shock that lasted for years. The funeral was a massive event, with hundreds of thousands of people following the casket through the streets of the capital, their voices rising in a final farewell. The rise of Manuel Noriega to absolute power began almost the moment the general's plane hit the mountain. He moved quickly to eliminate his rivals and consolidate his grip on the military and the state. He turned the dream of a free Panama into a nightmare of narco-dictatorship and international isolation. The legacy of Torrijos was slowly dismantled and replaced by a system of fear and corruption that would eventually lead to a bloody foreign invasion. As the massive ships transit through a fully independent Panama Canal in 2026, the memory of Omar Torrijos is still a central part of the Panamanian identity, but it is a memory tinged with the sadness of what might have been. His image can still be seen in the small villages he once loved, a reminder of a leader who actually listened to his people. The crash on Marta Mountain remains officially an accident, but very few people in the country believe the version of the story that was told by the military regime. The current status of the nation is one of a modern and growing economy, but the shadows of the past still linger in the halls of power. The canal is now fully under Panamanian control, fulfilling the dream that Torrijos worked so hard to achieve. However, the questions about that rainy afternoon in 1981 continue to haunt the survivors and the historians. The truth is buried deep in the jungle, hidden by the passage of time and the thick green forest. The forest on Marta Mountain has grown back over the scars of the impact, but the silence of that afternoon still echoes through every street in Panama. The transition from a high-altitude mystery in the mountains of Panama to a deep-seated corruption scandal in the markets of Vietnam is a journey across the complex web of global politics and greed. While Torrijos died in a tragedy that changed a nation, others were profiting from the desperate needs of a population struggling to survive. Power is a game played in many different arenas, from the clouds of the sky to the dusty streets of a food processing plant. The weight of a leader's death can sink a nation into darkness, just as the weight of systemic corruption can drain the lifeblood of a community. Both stories are defined by the hidden agendas of those who seek to profit from the chaos of history. As we leave the tropical heat of Panama and move toward the bustling energy of Ho Chi Minh City, we see that the scent of jet fuel is often replaced by the smell of fish and the sharp tang of a secret market in the night. On a humid night in September 1980, a group of economic inspectors moved through the dark streets of Ho Chi Minh City toward the Cao Tre food processing plant. The city was quiet, settled into the deep silence of the post-war era, where every resource was precious and every scrap of food was accounted for by the state. They carried flashlights and notebooks, their faces set in grim lines as they prepared to uncover a secret that would shake the entire nation. The plant was a massive complex of concrete and corrugated metal, a place that was supposed to be the beating heart of the city's food supply. Inside the gates, the air was cool and smelled of salt and processed meat, a scent that was a luxury to the millions of people living just outside the walls. The inspectors were led by a man who had spent his life serving the revolution, and he felt a deep sense of duty to ensure that the people were not being cheated. To understand what happened at Cao Tre, you have to understand the world of Vietnam in 1980. The war had been over for 5 years, but the peace was a difficult and hungry one. This was the era of the subsidy system, or bao cap, where every family was given a set of paper stamps that determined how much rice, meat, and cloth they could have each month. There were no supermarkets and no private shops, only the long, exhausted lines at the state stores. If you lived in Ho Chi Minh City back then, your entire world revolved around those lines. You would wake up at 4 in the morning just to place a brick or a basket in the queue to save your spot. The air in those lines was thick with the smell of sweat and the quiet desperation of parents who didn't know if the meat would run out before they reached the front. Every gram of pork was like a piece of gold, and every grain of rice was a small victory for survival. The Cao Tre food processing plant was the source of that hope. It was where the state processed the meat and the seafood that was supposed to be distributed to the struggling families. People looked at the trucks leaving the factory gates as if they were carrying a holy treasure. They believed that the workers and the managers inside were heroes, working day and night to ensure that no child went to bed hungry. The name Cao Tre was synonymous with the promise of a meal. Inside the factory, a group of high-ranking officials and managers moved through the refrigerated rooms with a different kind of purpose. They were men of power who had been given the responsibility of managing the nation's most precious resources. They wore clean uniforms and carried themselves with the authority of the party. To their subordinates, they were pillars of the new society, men who were above suspicion because they were the ones who made the rules. These managers lived in a world that the common people could only imagine. While the rest of the city was eating thin rice porridge mixed with sweet potatoes, these men were having private dinners with fresh beef and expensive alcohol. They had access to foreign goods that were smuggled in through the port, and their homes were filled with luxury items like televisions and radios that were impossible for a regular worker to buy. They felt that they had earned these perks. Nguyen was one of the lead administrators at Cao Tre, a man who had been promoted because of his impeccable record of service. He was known for his sharp mind and his ability to keep the complex production lines moving despite the shortages of fuel and spare parts. He spent his days walking through the factory floor, nodding to the workers and checking the weight of the meat crates. He was a man of many smiles, but his eyes were always calculating the hidden value. He had developed a very close relationship with several powerful officials in the city's distribution department. They would meet late at night in quiet offices to discuss the quotas and the delivery schedules. On the surface, they were planning how to better serve the public, but under the table, they were building a massive and invisible network of theft. They realized that a single crate of meat diverted to the black market was worth more than a year of their official salary. The plan was as simple as it was cruel. They would report that a shipment of pork had spoiled due to a refrigeration failure, or that a truck had been lost in an accident on the rough roads. In reality, that meat was being loaded onto private vehicles in the middle of the night and taken to the dark alleys of the underground markets. There, it was sold at 10 times the state price to those who had the money to pay, while the ration stamps of the poor became worthless. Nguyen spent his evenings looking at 2 different sets of books. One was for the government inspectors, showing a perfect balance of inputs and outputs that met every state requirement. The other was a small, leather-bound notebook that he kept in a hidden compartment of his desk. It contained the real numbers, the tons of meat that had vanished into the shadows, and the massive amounts of cash that were being funneled into his private stash. He felt completely untouchable. He believed that he was helping the economy by providing goods to those who could actually afford them, a twisted form of logic that allowed him to sleep soundly at night. He saw himself as a pioneer of a new kind of business, a man who was smarter than the rigid system he operated within. He felt a sense of pride in his ability to outmaneuver the state auditors, believing that his connections at the top would protect him from any consequences if he was ever caught. On that particular September evening, Nguyen was preparing for a secret meeting with a black market broker. He was expecting a delivery of several thousand rubles in cash, his share of a diverted shipment of high-grade seafood. He sat in his office, listening to the hum of the factory and the sound of the rain hitting the roof. He felt a surge of confidence as he touched the leather notebook, convinced that another successful year of profit was just ahead of him. While the administrator was planning his next luxury, the cameras across the street had already captured every stolen crate that would seal his fate. For months, a team of undercover investigators had been watching the factory from a nearby apartment. They had been counting every truck that entered and exited the gates and comparing those numbers to the official records. They had seen the private vehicles arriving at midnight, and they had tracked the meat to the secret warehouses in the city center. The state had decided to make an example of the cow tray case, to show the public that they were serious about fighting economic crimes. They had bypassed the local police, who were often in the pockets of the managers, and brought in a special task force of elite inspectors. These men were dedicated to the revolution, and they were disgusted by the betrayal of the people's trust. They were waiting for the perfect moment to strike when all the leaders were in one place. Nguyen reached for his tea, his hands steady and his mind focused on the upcoming transaction. He was thinking about a new house he wanted to build in the suburbs, a place with a large garden and a private well. The air in his office was cool, but he felt a sudden and strange vibration in the floorboards. He told himself it was just one of the heavy meat grinders being turned on for the night shift, a normal part of the factory's constant and rhythmic pulse. He looked toward the door and saw a shadow move across the frosted glass. He assumed it was his assistant coming to check on the night's paperwork. He felt a small chill run down his back, but he dismissed it as a draft from the open window. There was no reason to be afraid in his own office, a place where he held the power of life and death over the workers' livelihoods. He took a slow sip of his tea and waited for the door to open so he could finish his day. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, like a thick blanket being pulled over the entire factory. The usual sounds of the machinery seemed to fade away, replaced by the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on the concrete floor outside. Nguyen felt a sharp drop in the temperature of the room, and the smell of ozone filled the air. He told himself that it was just the storm outside. It was always doing that during the rainy season in the southern city. Suddenly, the door was kicked open and the office was flooded with the bright light of several high-powered flashlights. The inspectors moved with a clinical speed, surrounding the desk before Nguyen could even stand up. They did not say a word at first. They just began to pull the ledgers from the shelves and dump them onto the floor. Nguyen tried to shout about his rank and his connections, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of falling paper. One of the inspectors found the hidden compartment in the desk and pulled out the leather-bound notebook. As he flipped through the pages, his face turned a deep shade of red with anger. He looked at Nguyen with a gaze that was colder than any refrigeration unit in the factory. He didn't see a respected administrator. He saw a thief who had been stealing the food from the mouths of the hungry people. The evidence of the double accounting was absolute and final. The raid continued throughout the entire plant, with teams of soldiers seizing the private trucks that were waiting to be loaded. They found tons of meat that had been hidden behind crates of salt, ready to be moved to the black market. The workers watched in silence as their managers were led away in handcuffs, their faces hidden from the cameras. The news spread through the city by morning, bringing a sense of grim satisfaction to the people in the long lines. The trial of the Cowtray officials was a public spectacle that lasted for weeks. The state presented the leather notebook and the testimonies of the drivers who had been paid to move the illegal goods. The scale of the corruption was staggering, with millions of rubles having been stolen over the course of just 3 years. Nguyen sat in the courtroom, his once clean uniform now wrinkled, and his head bowed in a rare display of public shame and total defeat. I have spent a lot of time looking at the records of the Bao Cap era, and the Cowtray case is a haunting reminder of how easily power can be corrupted by greed. It shows that even in a system designed for equality, those at the top will always find a way to take more than their share. The detail that stays with me is the contrast between the luxury of the managers' lives and the empty rice pots of the families who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of their work. The aftermath of the scandal was a massive reorganization of the food distribution system in Vietnam. Many of the officials involved were sentenced to long prison terms, and some were even executed for their crimes against the state. The Cowtray factory was put under new management, but the trust of the people had been permanently damaged. It was one of the first times the government publicly admitted that corruption was a major threat to the nation's future. Seeing the successful global exports of the modern Cowtray brand in 2026, the Cowtray brand still exists, but it is now a modern and successful commercial enterprise that exports food all over the world. The era of ration stamps and empty stores is a distant memory for the younger generation, but for those who lived through it, the name still carries a faint echo of the darkness of 1980. The old factory buildings have been replaced by high-tech facilities, but the history remains buried in the files. The current status of the country is one of rapid growth and international integration, but the battle against corruption continues to be a central theme in Vietnamese politics. The Cowtray case is often cited as a foundational lesson in the importance of transparency and the need for a strong legal system. The ghosts of the warehouse have been laid to rest, but the lesson of their greed is one that the nation refuses to forget as it moves into the bright future. The betrayal of a hungry population for the sake of a private garden is a dark spiral that eventually leads to a dead end. While the managers of Cowtray were stealing meat in Ho Chi Minh City, another man of peace was facing a different kind of darkness on a remote island in the Pacific. Power can be used to feed or to starve, to liberate or to oppress. We are moving now from the humid alleys of Vietnam to the restless shores of New Caledonia for the next story. The path from the corruption of a food processing plant to the assassination of a political leader is one marked by the same disregard for human life and the same hunger for total control. Both stories involve the sudden and violent intrusion of greed and politics into the lives of ordinary people. As we leave the bustling streets of Asia and look toward the blue waters of the South Pacific, we see that the scent of salt air is often mixed with the smell of death. While the mothers of the city wept over empty rice pots, the men they trusted were building palaces out of stolen meat. On the evening of Saturday, September 19, 1981, a 37-year-old politician named Pierre de Clercq was sitting at a wooden desk in the living room of his home in Noumea, New Caledonia. The air was soft and carried the scent of hibiscus and the salty tang of the nearby Pacific Ocean. He was hunched over a stack of notes, the amber light of a desk lamp casting a warm and steady glow across his face as he worked late into the quiet evening hours. The house was a modest structure located on a quiet street, where the neighbors mostly kept to themselves, and the sounds of the night were usually limited to the rustle of palm fronds. Pierre felt a deep sense of peace as he worked, believing that his home was a sanctuary from the intense political storms that were beginning to brew across the island. He was a man of words and ideas, convinced that the power of the truth would always be enough to protect him from harm. Pierre de Clercq was a man of deep contradictions that made him both a hero and a target in the eyes of many. He was born in mainland France, a white man who had moved to the distant territory of New Caledonia to work as a teacher in a small village. But instead of remaining a colonial outsider, he had completely immersed himself in the culture and the struggles of the native Kanak people. He saw the injustices of the system and decided to do something to change it. He eventually rose to become the Secretary General of the Union Caledonienne, the primary political party fighting for the independence of the island from French rule. To the Kanak people, he was a brother and a tireless advocate who spoke their language and understood their pain. But to the pro-French loyalists, he was a traitor to his own race, a man who was trying to tear apart the fabric of the French Empire in the South Pacific with his every speech and every action. Despite the growing threats and the hateful letters that arrived in his mailbox every week, Pierre refused to let fear dictate his actions. He spent his days traveling to remote tribes, sitting on woven mats and listening to the elders tell stories of their ancestors. He believed that the future of New Caledonia belonged to all its inhabitants, regardless of their skin color. He envisioned a nation where everyone was equal, and the colonial past was finally buried forever. His personal life was filled with a quiet joy that he found in his wife and children. They were the center of his universe, and he worked hard to shield them from the vitriol of the political arena. He enjoyed taking long walks on the beach with his young daughter, teaching her the names of the different shells and the birds that nested in the cliffs. He wanted her to grow up in a world that was defined by love and respect, rather than by hatred and political division. On that specific Saturday, he had spent the afternoon playing in the garden with his kids, laughing as they chased each other through the tall grass. The sun had been bright, and the sky was a deep, endless blue that seemed to promise a long and peaceful future. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life he had built on this beautiful island. To him, the struggles of the week were worth it for these few hours of absolute and perfect family happiness in the sun. He had a favorite spot on the veranda where he would sit and watch the sunset every evening. He loved the way the light turned the ocean into a sheet of liquid gold before the stars began to poke through the darkening purple sky. It was a time for reflection and for finding the strength to continue his work the next day. He felt that the momentum for independence was building and that they were closer than ever to achieving their collective and noble national goal. His relationship with the local Kanak leaders was built on a foundation of mutual trust and a shared vision of liberty. They respected his intellect and his willingness to sacrifice his own comfort for their cause. He was often the only white face in a sea of black skin at the political rallies, but he never felt like an outsider. He believed that the shared human desire for freedom was more powerful than any racial or cultural barrier that existed in the modern world. He was currently drafting a major proposal for the upcoming negotiations with the French government in Paris. He believed that if he could present a clear and logical path to sovereignty, he could avoid the violence that many feared was inevitable. He spent hours researching international law and the history of other decolonization movements. He was a man of peace who believed that a well-written document could be more effective than 1,000 loaded guns in a war. His habits were simple and focused on the needs of his community and his family. He drove an old car and wore modest clothes, choosing to spend his salary on books and supplies for the local schools. He was a man who lived his values every single day, never asking for more than he was willing to give to others. People in Noumea would see him at the market and wave, recognizing the man who had given up everything to fight for the rights of the indigenous population. He felt that his presence on the island was a bridge between two worlds that were increasingly at odds with each other. He hoped to show his fellow Frenchmen that supporting independence was not an act of betrayal, but an act of justice. He believed that by working together, they could create a unique and prosperous society that would be a model for the rest of the world. He was a man of immense hope and a deep, unshakable faith in the goodness of all humanity. He was writing a letter for peace, while a man in the bushes was adjusting the scope for a war he never saw coming through that window. For the past several weeks, a small group of radical loyalists had been monitoring his house from a car parked down the street. They had mapped out his routine and identified the exact window where he sat to do his work every evening. They didn't see a bridge or a man of peace. They saw a dangerous obstacle that needed to be removed with total violence. They had chosen this particular night because many of the local police were busy with a large festival on the other side of the city. The street was dark, and the neighbors were either out or asleep in their beds. The assassins moved with a cold and calculated precision, their movements hidden by the deep shadows of the tropical vegetation. They were not looking for a debate or a negotiation. They were looking for a clear and unobstructed shot at their political target. The air in the living room was perfectly still, the only sound being the soft scratching of Pierre's pen against the paper. He paused for a second and looked toward the open window, feeling a sudden and strange shift in the atmosphere outside. The usual chorus of the night insects had abruptly stopped, leaving a heavy and unnatural silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. He felt a slight chill run down his spine, but he dismissed it as just a cold draft. He saw a flash of movement in the bushes near the edge of the property, a shadow that seemed to be out of place in the familiar landscape of his garden. He told himself it was probably just a stray dog or perhaps a large fruit bat flying low through the trees. He was a man of logic who didn't believe in ghosts or omens, so he took a deep breath and returned to his notes. It is just the wind, he thought to himself. The wind always makes the tropical leaves dance. The scent of the jasmine flowers outside seemed to grow stronger, becoming almost cloying in its intensity. Pierre reached up to rub his eyes, feeling a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over him. He decided he would finish just one more page before heading to bed to join his wife. He believed that he was safe in his own home, surrounded by the love of his family and the respect of his community. He did not realize that the window was not a view, but a wooden frame. The sound of the shot was a sharp and singular crack that shattered the peaceful silence of the neighborhood. It was so loud and so sudden that it didn't even sound like a gun at first, more like a heavy piece of furniture falling over in the next room. Pierre didn't have time to react or to look away from his desk. The bullet had been fired from a high-powered rifle, and it traveled through the glass window with a terrifying and absolute speed toward his unprotected back. The projectile struck him between the shoulder blades, tearing through his lungs and his heart with a devastating efficiency. He was thrown forward onto his desk, his blood instantly soaking into the notes he had been so carefully drafting. The pen fell from his hand and rolled across the floor, leaving a thin trail of blue ink behind it. He didn't make a sound, the life leaving his body in a single, silent moment of profound and absolute political violence. His wife, who had been resting in the bedroom just down the hall, was jolted awake by the sound of the explosion. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to understand what had happened. She called out his name, but there was no response from the living room. The silence that followed the shot was even more terrifying than the noise itself, a heavy and suffocating quiet that seemed to fill every corner of the small house in the city of Noumea. She ran into the living room and found her husband slumped over his desk, the amber light of the lamp still illuminating the scene. She screamed for help, her voice echoing through the quiet street and waking the neighbors. She tried to lift him to see if he was still breathing, but she could see the massive exit wound in his chest and the sheer amount of blood on the floor. She knew in an instant that the man she loved was gone, taken away by a hidden shadow. The neighbors rushed to the house, some carrying flashlights and others already calling for the police and an ambulance. They found the window shattered and the scent of gunpowder still lingering in the air. A few of the men ran into the garden, searching for any sign of the shooter, but the bushes were empty and the street was dark. The assassins had vanished into the night, leaving behind a scene of absolute devastation and a nation on the brink of a total war. The news of the assassination spread through the city of Noumea like a wildfire, and by midnight, hundreds of Kanak supporters had gathered outside the house. They were silent at first, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of candles, but the silence soon turned into a low and angry murmur. They had lost their most powerful voice, and they knew instinctively that this was not a random act of crime, but a calculated strike against their future freedom. The next morning, the anger boiled over into the streets. Riots broke out across the island, with protesters burning cars and clashing with the French security forces. Roadblocks were set up on every major highway, and the indigenous population began to arm themselves for a conflict they had hoped to avoid. The death of Pierre Declercq had become the spark that ignited a period of near-civil war that would be known as the events in New Caledonia for many years. The French authorities launched a massive investigation, under intense pressure from both the local population and the government in Paris. They searched the garden and found a single spent casing from a 75mm rifle. They also discovered a set of footprints leading toward a nearby alley where a car had been waiting. They were able to identify a primary suspect, a local Frenchman named Dominic, who had been vocal about his hatred for Pierre. Dominic was arrested and charged with the murder, and for a brief moment it seemed like justice might be served. The trial was a tense and highly publicized affair, with the courtroom surrounded by armed guards to prevent any violence between the rival factions. The prosecution presented the evidence of his political motives and the forensic links to the weapon used in the hit. But as the trial progressed, the case began to fall apart in a very suspicious way. Key witnesses suddenly changed their stories or refused to testify, claiming they had been threatened by loyalist paramilitary groups. The forensic evidence was questioned by high-priced defense attorneys who were being funded by anonymous sources in the business community. The judge seemed to favor the defense at every turn, dismissing several pieces of critical evidence as inadmissible. The air in the courtroom was thick with the scent of a cover-up and fear. To the shock and horror of the Kanak people, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. Dominic walked out of the courtroom a free man, surrounded by a cheering crowd of pro-French loyalists who saw him as a hero of their cause. The acquittal was seen as the final proof that the legal system was rigged against the indigenous population and those who supported them. The violence on the island intensified, with both sides realizing that the law had failed them. The forensic report on the body of Pierre de Clercq was a cold and clinical description of the damage a single bullet can do to a human being. It noted that the shot had been fired from a distance of about 30 feet, indicating a high level of skill and a calm hand. The path of the bullet had been perfectly straight, entering through the back and exiting through the heart. It was a professional execution designed to ensure that the target had zero chance of survival. The aftermath of the assassination was a decade of instability and bloodshed that scarred the beautiful island of New Caledonia. The events led to a massive increase in the French military presence and a series of violent clashes that left dozens of people dead on both sides. The dream of a peaceful transition to independence was replaced by a cycle of revenge and hatred that lasted for years. The name Pierre de Clercq became a rallying cry for the resistance. The primary suspect in the assassination was a local Frenchman named Dominic, who was 34 years old at the time of the shooting. He had a long history of involvement with far-right paramilitary groups and had been arrested previously for political violence. The evidence against him included a rifle of the same caliber used in the murder and witnesses who saw his car near the scene. However, the influence of his powerful allies ensured that he never served a day. Amidst the ongoing political debates over the future of the island in 2026, the political status of New Caledonia is still a matter of intense debate and frequent referendums. The island remains a French territory, though it has been granted a significant amount of autonomy in recent years. The house where Pierre was killed has been turned into a small library and cultural center, a place where his notes and speeches are preserved for future generations. His vision of a unified nation still remains an unfulfilled dream. The most haunting detail of the crime is not the shot itself, but the unfinished sentence on the page where Pierre had been writing. He was in the middle of a thought about the necessity of mutual respect between the two cultures when the bullet ended his life. The blue ink trail across the desk is a permanent reminder of how quickly a voice for peace can be silenced by those who prefer the darkness of war. He used a pen for freedom, they used a bullet for power. The silence that followed the shot in Noumea was a heavy weight that crushed the hope of a nation. But in the Soviet Union, a different kind of darkness was growing within the hearts of the elite. While Pierre was dying for his principles, a group of privileged young men in Tajikistan were beginning to hunt for sport and for gold. We are moving now from the blue waters of the Pacific to the frozen streets of Dushanbe, where the wolves did not come from the forest. On a freezing Tuesday evening in December 1981, a 45-year-old woman named Elena Petrova was standing in her brightly lit kitchen in a luxury apartment building in Dushanbe, Tajikistan. The air was filled with the savory scent of borscht and the warmth of a steaming teapot on the stove. She moved with a quiet grace, humming a soft melody while she set the table for her husband, a high-ranking judge who was expected home at any minute. The apartment was a symbol of absolute status, located in a district reserved for the most powerful families in the Soviet Republic. Through the large windows, the snow was falling in heavy white flakes, blanketing the wide boulevards of the capital city. Elena felt a deep sense of security within these walls, believing that the prestige of her husband's position was an invisible shield that kept the cold and the dangers of the world far away from her door. Dushanbe in the early 1980s was known as one of the safest and most beautiful cities in the entire Soviet Union. It was a place of wide avenues lined with towering poplar trees and intricate fountains that danced in the summer heat. People walked the streets late at night without a single thought of fear, trusting in the absolute order maintained by the state. To the elite families who lived there, the city was a private paradise of comfort and safety. The Petrova family had lived in this district for over 10 years, building a life that was the envy of the working class. Their home was filled with rare books, Persian carpets, and a collection of fine crystal that caught the morning light. Elena spent her days organizing social events for the wives of other officials, and her nights were filled with the quiet dignity of a life well lived. She believed that she was part of a permanent and untouchable upper class. But beneath this surface of socialist perfection, a new and dangerous subculture was beginning to form among the children of the elite. These young men, often referred to as the Golden Youth, had grown up with every advantage and none of the hardships of their parents. They were bored with the rigid rules of the party and fascinated by the forbidden luxury of the Western world. They wanted fast cars, expensive denim, and the thrill of living on the edge. Among this group was a small and secretive circle that began to call themselves the Night Wolves. They were the sons of ministers, police chiefs, and high-ranking judges, boys who had been raised in the very same apartments they would eventually target. They knew the layout of the buildings and the schedules of the security guards. Most importantly, they knew which families kept stashes of foreign currency and gold jewelry hidden away in their private safes. The leader of the group was a 20-year-old named Sergei, whose father was a powerful official in the Ministry of the Interior. Sergei was charismatic and cruel, a young man who felt that the laws of the land simply did not apply to him. He spent his nights drinking imported vodka and listening to smuggled rock records, convinced that he was a predator in a world of sheep. He viewed the wealth of his neighbors as a resource that was rightfully his to take. Sergei and his followers began with small thefts, stealing Western magazines or expensive lighters from their own parents. But the thrill of the small score soon faded, and they began to crave something more intense. They started to plan elaborate home invasions, using their inside knowledge to bypass the locks and the guards. They didn't need the money to survive. They wanted it to prove that they were the masters of the city and that they were untouchable. The bonding within the group was intense, a brotherhood of privilege and shared secrets that was built on the excitement of their crimes. They would meet in the back of expensive restaurants, whispering about their next target, while their fathers sat just a few tables away. They felt a sense of superiority over the common people, believing that their bloodline gave them the right to do whatever they pleased. They were the wolves, and the city was their forest. Elena Petrova knew many of these young men, as they were the children of her friends and colleagues. She had seen them grow up, attending their birthday parties and giving them gifts on the various holidays. She thought of them as bright and promising students who would one day lead the nation. She never suspected that the polite boy who held the door for her in the lobby was the same person who was mapping out the vulnerabilities of her own front door. The Night Wolves spent weeks preparing for the invasion of the Petrova apartment, watching the building from the park across the street. They noted the exact time the husband left for work and when the cleaning lady went home for the day. They were looking for the perfect window of opportunity when Elena would be alone and the halls would be quiet. They moved with a clinical detachment that they had learned from the crime dramas they watched in secret. On that freezing December night, Elena was feeling a strange sense of anticipation for the coming new year. She was planning a grand dinner party and had been reviewing the guest list earlier in the afternoon. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction with her life, believing that she had achieved everything a woman in her position could hope for. She walked to the window and adjusted the heavy velvet curtains, blocking out the cold and the dark of the night. She had a favorite armchair where she liked to sit and knit while the soup was simmering on the stove. It was a peaceful routine that she had followed for years, a way to unwind after a busy day of social obligations. She enjoyed the quiet of the apartment and the feeling of warmth from the radiator. She felt completely and utterly safe, convinced that nothing could ever disturb the tranquility of her home. Everything was perfect, just the way she wanted it to be. She was setting a table for her family, unaware that the polite boys from the hallway had already turned a stolen master key in her front door. The Night Wolves were not in some distant part of the city. They were already inside the building, standing just one floor below her. They were checking their masks and their weapons, their hearts racing with the adrenaline of the hunt. The boy she had once given a box of chocolates to was now holding a long hunting knife and waiting for the signal. They had stolen the master key from the building manager's office a week earlier, giving them access to every unit in the complex. They didn't have to break a window or kick in a door. They could simply walk in like they belonged there. They moved through the hallway with a practiced silence, their boots muffled by the thick red carpet. They reached the door of the Petrova apartment and paused, listening to the muffled sounds of the radio playing inside the home. Sergei took a deep breath and signaled for his two companions to get ready. He felt a surge of power as he gripped the metal handle, knowing that he was about to shatter the life of a woman who had known him since he was a child. He didn't feel any guilt or any hesitation, only a cold and sharp curiosity about how she would react when she saw him. He turned the key in the lock with a smooth and silent motion, the mechanism clicking into place with ease. The sound of the door opening was so faint that Elena almost didn't hear it over the sound of the bubbling soup. She thought for a second that it was just her husband returning early from the court, and she called out his name with a smile. But there was no answer from the hallway, only a heavy and unnatural silence that seemed to fill the entire apartment in an instant. She felt a sudden and sharp chill, as if the front door had been left wide open to the snow. She stood up from her chair and walked toward the foyer, her heart starting to beat a little faster in her chest. She saw three dark figures standing in the shadows, their faces covered by black woolen masks that only showed their cold and glowing eyes. The scent of expensive cologne and damp wool filled the small space, a smell that was hauntingly familiar to her. She told herself that it was just a prank or a mistake, perhaps some of the neighbors' children. The silence in the room was absolute, a weight that made it hard for Elena to draw a full breath. She looked at the tallest figure and noticed the way he held himself, a rigid and arrogant posture that she recognized from the social galas she attended. She convinced herself that if she just spoke to them, they would realize their mistake and leave. It is just a misunderstanding, she thought to herself. These are good boys from good families. They mean no harm. The self-deception was shattered when Sergei stepped forward and placed the cold edge of a hunting knife against her throat. He didn't say a word. He just gestured for her to move toward the living room. Elena felt the sharpness of the steel against her skin and realized with a terrifying clarity that she was no longer in control of her world. The luxury of the apartment now felt like a cage, and the status she had relied on was nothing more than a thin paper wall. They forced her onto the Persian rug and demanded to know the location of the safe. Their voices were muffled by the masks, but Elena could still hear the youthful energy and the lack of any empathy in their tone. She pointed toward the hidden compartment behind the bookshelf, her hands shaking so hard that she could barely speak. She watched as they began to tear the room apart, throwing her precious crystal and books onto the floor with a total disregard. The night wolves were not looking for food or clothing. They were searching for the items that defined their secret lives. They pulled out the stacks of American dollars and the gold coins that her husband had collected over decades. They laughed as they filled their bags with the jewelry and the expensive watches. The destruction was systematic and brutal, a way for them to vent their frustration against the world that had given them everything but a purpose. As they worked, Sergei began to taunt her, mentioning specific details about her life that only a close family friend would know. He spoke about her daughter's school and the recent promotion of her husband. Elena felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she realized that she was being hunted by the very people she had welcomed into her home. The betrayal was far more painful than the physical threat, a deep wound that tore through her sense of reality and trust. The spiral of violence escalated when one of the younger boys noticed the gold wedding ring on Elena's finger. He reached down and tried to pull it off, but her knuckles were swollen from the cold. Instead of waiting or using soap, he pulled out a pair of wire cutters and threatened to take the finger with the ring. The callousness of the threat was terrifying, showing a level of depravity that was usually reserved for the most hardened of the career criminals. Elena began to plead for her life, promising them that she would never tell the police or her husband about what had happened. She was weeping now, her face pressed into the carpet she had once been so proud of. She was a woman of high status, begging for mercy from a group of boys who were barely old enough to shave. The power dynamic of the city had been completely inverted in the span of a few minutes, leaving her at the mercy of the bored and the cruel. The climax of the nightmare occurred when they heard the sound of a key turning in the front door. Elena's husband had finally returned from the court, his arms full of groceries and a newspaper. Before he could even set his bags down, the night wolves were upon him. They didn't want to just rob him, they wanted to humiliate the man who represented the very law they despised. They forced the judge to his knees and made him watch as they continued the robbery. The violence that followed was a frantic and chaotic explosion of suppressed rage. They struck the judge with the butt of a pistol and kicked him until he was barely conscious. They weren't just taking the money anymore, they were taking revenge on the generation that had built the gray world they lived in. The sounds of the struggle were muffled by the snow outside, leaving the apartment as a silent island of horror in the middle of the sleeping and quiet city. In a final act of absolute cruelty, Sergei decided that they could not leave any witnesses who could identify them. He looked at the woman who had once given him chocolates and the man who had been his father's friend for 20 years. He moved with a clinical speed, using the hunting knife to ensure that they would never speak a word about the events of that night. The blood of the elite stained the Persian rug, a dark and permanent mark on the family's legacy. The forensic evidence gathered later showed that the murders were committed with a high degree of precision, indicating that the killers were calm and methodical. There were no signs of a forced entry, and the lack of any fingerprints suggested that they were professional or very well prepared. The investigation found that several other high-profile families had been targeted in a similar fashion over the last year, with all the victims having been killed. The discovery of the stolen goods in the homes of the city's most powerful officials was the detail that eventually broke the case. A young investigator, who was not yet corrupted by the system, found a missing watch in the bedroom of a police chief's son. This led to a series of raids that uncovered the massive stash of gold and foreign currency hidden in the luxury apartments. The realization that the killers were their own children was a shock to the party. The state moved quickly to suppress the news, fearing that a public scandal of this magnitude would lead to a total loss of faith in the leadership. The trials were held in absolute secrecy, and the families of the victims were told to remain silent for the good of the nation. The Night Wolves were not treated like common criminals, but like a political embarrassment that needed to be erased. The true details of the murders were hidden away for many decades. The aftermath of the Night Wolves' murders was a quiet and brutal purge of the local interior ministry and the police force. Many officials were forced to resign or were transferred to remote outposts in the east as punishment for their children's crimes. The luxury apartments where the murders took place were boarded up and left to rot, a haunting reminder of the night the elite were hunted by their own. The city of Dushanbe never felt quite as safe as before. The offender profile of the Night Wolves shows a group of young men who had become completely detached from the reality of their society. They were the product of a system that provided material comfort but zero moral guidance. Most of the members were sentenced to long terms in the labor camps, but because of their parents' connections, many of them were released early or had their sentences reduced. They were allowed to fade back into the shadows of the nation. Scanning the faces of the powerful business elite in Dushanbe today, in 2026, some of the former members of the Night Wolves have reinvented themselves as successful businessmen or politicians in the independent Republic of Tajikistan. They have used their old connections to build new empires of wealth and influence, leaving their violent past far behind them. The families of the victims have mostly passed away or left the city, their stories forgotten by a generation that is more interested in the future. The most chilling detail of the case is that the neighbors reported hearing nothing that night, even though the apartment was located in a building with thin walls. The silence of the elite was so absolute that it allowed a pack of wolves to feed in the middle of the city without any interference. Those who believed they were the masters of the world were betrayed by the very children they had raised to replace them. Those wolves grew up in the room next to yours. We have traveled across many continents and through many decades tonight, looking at the ways power can be seized and the ways it can be lost in a single and violent instant. These stories remind us that the world is a far more fragile and dangerous place than we often like to admit to ourselves. From the streets of Paraguay to the halls of Baghdad and the apartments of Dushanbe, the shadows are always waiting for the perfect moment to move into the light. I hope you have found these stories as fascinating and as haunting as I have. If you are still awake and listening to the rain, please take a second to hit the subscribe button and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support helps me to keep digging into the archives to find the truth about these forgotten mysteries. We are a small community of seekers, and I am grateful for every one of you who decides to walk this path with me in the dark. It is time now to let the world fade away and to find some rest after this long journey through the strange, dark, and mysterious corners of history. Take a deep breath and feel the safety of your own bed, knowing that for now, the doors are locked and the windows are closed against the cold night air. Sleep well tonight, but never forget that the people who know you the best are often the ones who are the most dangerous of all.